Hello everyone. Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The endless search. From Marcus, the radio dial started spinning on its own somewhere outside Bakersfield, and that should have been my first warning to pull over and call it a night. But when you're hauling 30,000 pounds of frozen goods on a deadline, and the nearest truck stop is still 40 miles down the interstate, you learn to ignore the small mechanical hiccups that plague these older rigs. My 2018 Peterbilt had been good to me for over 300,000 miles, and I figured a loose connection in the radio was hardly worth stopping for. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of Highway 99, the kind of flat, moonlit expanse that makes you feel like you're driving through the bottom of an ancient sea, and the steady hum of the diesel engine had settled into that hypnotic rhythm that could lull a driver into dangerous complacency if he wasn't careful. I reached over to steady the dial, watching it slowly rotate through the AM frequencies like it was searching for something specific. The static crackled and hissed through the speakers, occasionally catching fragments of distant stations, late-night talk shows discussing conspiracy theories, Spanish-language music bleeding in from Mexico, the lonely sound of trucker chatter on the CB frequencies that somehow the regular radio was picking up. Each station would fade in for just a moment before the dial continued its patient rotation, never stopping, never settling, just endlessly seeking something that seemed to remain perpetually out of reach. The dashboard lights cast everything in that familiar amber glow, and I could hear the refrigeration unit cycling on and off behind me, keeping my cargo of frozen vegetables at the precise temperature required by the contract. Outside, the California desert rolled past like a black ocean dotted with the occasional cluster of lights marking some small town or truck stop. The air conditioning hummed steadily, fighting against the residual heat that still radiated up from the asphalt even though it was well past midnight. I'd been driving for nearly 10 hours, and my eyes felt scratchy and dry despite the coffee I'd been nursing since Fresno. At first, the dial's movement seemed random, but after watching it for nearly an hour, I began to notice a pattern. It would sweep through the lower frequencies quickly, barely pausing on any station, but as it climbed toward the higher numbers, it would slow down, lingering on certain frequencies as if tasting them, testing them for something I couldn't understand. The static would change texture during these pauses, becoming thicker, more purposeful, like the sound of wind through a vast empty space or the whisper of sand across stone. I tried manually adjusting the dial several times, but my hand would barely release the tuning knob before it began turning again, always in the same direction, always with that same patient searching movement. The radio was a standard factory model, nothing fancy, just the basic AM/FM unit that came with the truck, but now it seemed to have developed a will of its own. I considered switching it off entirely, but the thought of driving through the desert night in complete silence felt somehow worse than dealing with the endlessly cycling static. Around 2 in the morning, as I was climbing the grade toward the grapevine, the dial began to slow its rotation. Instead of the quick sweep through frequencies, it started lingering longer on each station, and the static began to resolve into something that almost sounded like voices. Not clear enough to make out words, but with the rhythm and cadence of human speech, multiple voices overlapping and interweaving like a conversation heard through water or from a great distance. The voices had a quality that made the hair on my arms stand up, something urgent and pleading in their tone, though I couldn't understand what they might be trying to communicate. I reached for the CB radio to check in with other drivers, hoping to hear a familiar voice to break the growing tension that was building in the cab. But when I keyed the microphone, all I heard was the same layered static that was coming from the regular radio. Even more disturbing, I could hear my own voice echoing back through the speakers, delayed and distorted, as if my words were being broadcast somewhere and then reflected back to me from an impossible distance. I tried different channels, but they all carried the same strange echo, the same sense of vast empty space that seemed to swallow my voice and return it changed. The dial continued its slow rotation, and with each new frequency the voices became clearer, more distinct. I began to recognize what sounded like truckers' voices, the familiar cadence and terminology of drivers calling out their positions, reporting road conditions, sharing information about rest stops and way stations. But something was wrong with these transmissions. The locations they mentioned didn't exist on any map I knew. Highways with numbers that made no sense. Cities with names that sounded almost familiar but not quite right, as if they were places that might exist in a world parallel to our own, but separated by some thin membrane that radio waves could somehow penetrate. One voice, clearer than the others, began calling out what sounded like my own route, southbound on the 99, approaching the Grapevine, carrying refrigerated cargo to Los Angeles. But the voice was describing details I hadn't shared with anyone, specifics about my load, my schedule, even the fact that I'd stopped for coffee at a particular truck stop in Fresno. The voice had the same flat, professional tone I'd heard thousands of times on CB radio, but hearing my own journey described by a stranger sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I glanced at my GPS, confirming my position, but the screen seemed dim and unclear, the familiar map overlaid with strange symbols and route markers that flickered in and out of existence. The mile markers I passed seemed to be counting in the wrong direction, and the exit signs were becoming increasingly difficult to read, as if they were written in a language that was almost English but not quite. The road ahead remained clearly visible in my headlights, the familiar asphalt and lane markings exactly as they should be, but something fundamental about the landscape felt different, shifted somehow, like looking at a photograph that had been altered so subtly that you couldn't identify exactly what was wrong. The radio dial suddenly stopped rotating, settling on a frequency somewhere in the highest range of the AM band, a section where normally you'd find nothing but static and occasionally some distant foreign broadcasts. But instead of static, the speakers filled with clear, distinct chatter from multiple truck drivers, all describing journeys through landscapes that sounded like twisted versions of routes I knew well. They spoke of truck stops that never closed their doors to let drivers leave, of way stations where trucks were measured not just for weight, but for something else entirely, of highways that led to destinations that weren't marked on any earthly map. One driver was describing a rest area where all the other trucks in the lot were identical copies of his own rig, down to the same company logos and license plates, but when he approached them, he found they were all empty, their engines still warm even though no other drivers were anywhere to be found. Another voice talked about delivering cargo to warehouses that existed only at night, facilities that would vanish completely with the sunrise, leaving only empty lots and the persistent feeling that the delivery had been terribly important to someone or something he would never understand. As I listened, I realized that my own voice was among them now, describing my current journey in that same flat, professional tone, but I wasn't speaking. My mouth was closed, my hands were on the steering wheel, yet I could clearly hear myself reporting my position, my cargo, my destination, adding my voice to the chorus of drivers who seemed to be traveling through a version of the highway system that existed parallel to the one I thought I knew. The voice that sounded like me was describing details I hadn't noticed myself. Exit ramps that led to places with names I'd never heard, rest stops with facilities that defied logical description, truck stops where the fuel pumps dispensed something that wasn't quite gasoline but burned just the same. The landscape outside began to change in subtle ways that I noticed only gradually. The familiar desert scrub gave way to vegetation I couldn't identify, plants that seemed to grow in patterns too regular to be natural, arranged in geometric designs that hurt to look at directly. The mountains in the distance retained their general shape, but seemed to have gained additional peaks and ridges that shifted position when I wasn't looking directly at them. The moon, which had been bright and clear earlier, now appeared to be the wrong size, too large and casting shadows that fell at impossible angles. I tried to convince myself that fatigue was playing tricks with my perception, that long-haul drivers often experienced mild hallucinations after too many hours on the road, but the radio voices continued their impossible broadcasting, describing a journey that matched mine exactly while taking them through places that couldn't exist. My fuel gauge showed that I still had plenty of diesel, but I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen a mile marker or an exit sign that I could read clearly. The road stretched ahead exactly as a highway should, but I was no longer certain it was taking me toward Los Angeles or any destination that existed in the world I'd started from. The radio dial began turning again, slower now, searching through frequencies that seemed to exist between the standard broadcast bands, picking up signals from sources that broadcast from no earthly transmission tower. The voice in the tank, from Marcus. The interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon through the Nevada desert, my Peterbilt's headlights cutting through the darkness as I hauled 30 tons of construction equipment toward Reno. It was past 2 in the morning, and the familiar hum of the diesel engine beneath me had become a lullaby after 18 hours on the road. The fuel gauge showed just under a quarter tank, which meant I'd need to stop soon. But out here in the middle of nowhere, gas stations were as rare as rain. I'd been driving long haul for nearly 15 years, and this stretch of highway had become as familiar as my own backyard. The same exit signs, the same rock formations silhouetted against the star-filled sky, the same lonely truck stop about 20 miles ahead where I could grab fuel and maybe a stale sandwich. Tonight felt different, though, in that subtle way that makes the hair on your arm stand up without any obvious reason. The radio had been crackling with static for the past hour, picking up nothing but fragments of distant conversations and the occasional burst of Spanish music from some far-off station. The temperature gauge held steady, the air pressure was good, and all my lights were working. But something felt wrong with my rig. It was nothing I could put my finger on, just a sense that something had changed since my last fuel stop in Carson City. Maybe it was the way the steering wheel vibrated just slightly differently, or how the engine note seemed to carry an odd harmonic that I hadn't noticed before. After so many years behind the wheel, you develop an almost supernatural awareness of your truck's personality. Every quirk and characteristic becomes as familiar as your own heartbeat. The truck stop appeared in my headlights exactly where I expected it, a small oasis of fluorescent light surrounded by the vast darkness of the desert. Only 2 other trucks sat in the parking area, their drivers probably catching a few hours of sleep before dawn. I pulled up to the diesel pumps and shut down the engine, immediately noticing how the sudden silence seemed to press against my ears. Even the wind had died down, leaving an unsettling stillness that made me glance around nervously as I climbed down from the cab. The night air carried that distinctive desert chill that comes after sunset, sharp and clean with hints of sage and distant mountains. My boots crunched on the gravel as I walked around to the fuel tank, pulling my wallet from my back pocket and mentally calculating how much diesel I'd need to make it to my delivery point. The pump clicked and hummed as I selected my grade and inserted my fleet card, the familiar routine as automatic as breathing after all these years on the road. I reached for the fuel cap on the driver's side tank, my fingers wrapping around the familiar metal surface, when the most horrific sound I'd ever heard pierced the desert silence. It was a scream, high-pitched and agonized like someone in terrible pain, but it seemed to come from directly beneath my hand. I jerked my arm back instinctively, my heart hammering against my ribs as I stared at the fuel cap in shock. The scream had been brief but unmistakably human, filled with such raw terror and suffering that it made my skin crawl. I stood there for a long moment, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it, that the sound had come from somewhere else, maybe from the truck stop or one of the other vehicles. But deep down I knew what I'd heard, and I knew exactly where it had come from. The fuel cap looked perfectly normal, just weathered aluminum with the usual scratches and road dirt. Nothing to suggest anything supernatural or unusual. I glanced around the parking lot, but the other trucks remained dark and silent, their drivers apparently undisturbed by whatever I'd experienced. With trembling fingers, I reached toward the cap again, moving slowly and deliberately. The moment my skin made contact with the metal, another scream erupted, this one longer and more desperate than the first. It was definitely coming from the fuel cap itself, as if someone were trapped inside the tank crying out in anguish every time I touched the opening to their prison. I snatched my hand away again, taking several steps backward and looking wildly around for some explanation, some rational cause for what was happening. The truck stop attendant visible through the brightly lit windows continued reading his magazine, completely oblivious to the supernatural drama playing out just 50 feet away. The other trucks remained silent, their drivers either asleep or simply not close enough to hear what I was experiencing. I felt completely alone with this impossible situation, standing in a pool of fluorescent light while something inside my own fuel tank screamed in apparent agony every time I tried to refuel. I tried approaching from different angles, thinking maybe I could grab the cap quickly and twist it off before whatever was causing the screaming could react. But every single time my fingertips brushed against the metal surface, that horrible cry would tear through the night air, filled with such genuine suffering that I found myself apologizing to the darkness. The sound was definitely human, not mechanical or electronic, with all the subtle variations and emotional depth that only a person in real distress could produce. After several more failed attempts, I noticed that the screaming was beginning to change. What had started as wordless cries of pain were gradually becoming more articulate, though I couldn't quite make out what was being said. It sounded like someone trying to speak through water or thick glass, the words distorted but clearly desperate. I leaned closer despite every instinct telling me to walk away, and tried to understand what the voice was trying to communicate. The next time I touched the fuel cap, the scream resolved into something that chilled me to the bone. It was a woman's voice, pleading and terrified, saying the same phrase over and over. "Don't let him find me, don't let him find me. Please don't let him find me." The words were crystal clear now, spoken with such desperate urgency that I could feel tears forming in my eyes. Whoever she was, wherever she was terrified of someone or something, and somehow her voice was coming through my truck's fuel system. I pulled out my cell phone and considered calling the police, but what would I tell them? That my fuel cap was screaming? That there seemed to be a woman trapped somewhere in my diesel tank? They'd either think I was crazy or having some kind of breakdown from too many hours on the road. But I couldn't just ignore what was happening. Couldn't pretend that everything was normal when someone was clearly in desperate need of help. As I stood there trying to decide what to do, I became aware of headlights approaching from the east, moving fast along the dark highway. The vehicle slowed as it neared the truck stop, and I watched nervously as a black sedan pulled into the parking lot. Something about the way it moved, predatory and purposeful, made me instinctively step back into the shadows between two parked trucks. The sedan cruised slowly through the lot, its occupants apparently looking for something or someone. The car stopped directly beside my truck, and I could see two figures in the front seats. Though their faces remained hidden in shadow, they sat there for several long minutes, engine running, as if waiting for something to happen. Then the passenger door opened and a tall man in a dark coat stepped out. He moved with calm deliberation toward my truck, and I realized with growing horror that he was heading straight for the fuel tank area. I watched from my hiding place as the man approached my truck's fuel cap, and when he reached out to touch it, the screaming began again, but this time it was different. The woman's voice was shrieking in absolute terror, the words barely coherent. "No, no, no, he found me, somebody help me please." The man seemed to hear the voice as clearly as I did. because he smiled in the darkness, a cold expression that made my blood run cold. He placed his hand flat against the fuel cap, and the screaming intensified until it was almost unbearable. Then he began to speak in a low voice that I could barely hear from my hiding place. He was talking to whoever was making those sounds, his tone conversational but somehow menacing. I couldn't make out his exact words, but the woman's voice became more and more frantic, pleading and sobbing with genuine terror. I knew I had to do something, but I felt completely helpless against whatever supernatural force was at work here. The logical part of my mind kept insisting that this was all impossible, that voices couldn't come from fuel tanks and strange men couldn't have conversations with screaming metal caps. But my eyes and ears were telling me a very different story, and every instinct I possessed was screaming that I was witnessing something deeply evil. The man suddenly looked up and stared directly at my hiding place, as if he'd known I was there all along. His eyes reflected the fluorescent lights like an animal's, and when he smiled again, I could see that his teeth were too sharp, too white in the artificial glare. He said something to his companion in the car, then began walking slowly in my direction. I didn't wait to see what he wanted. I sprinted toward the truck stop building, hoping to find safety among other people, but when I burst through the glass doors, the circular route from Marcus Dyer, the GPS had been glitching for the past hour, its blue dot spinning lazily on a road that shouldn't exist according to any map I'd ever seen. I'd been driving long haul for 15 years, knew every interstate and back road from Seattle to Miami, but this stretch of asphalt seemed to materialize from nowhere in the Nevada desert. My Kenworth's diesel engine hummed its familiar tune, a sound that usually brought comfort during these lonely midnight runs, but tonight it felt different somehow, like a lullaby sung in a minor key. The headlights carved through darkness so complete it seemed to swallow light itself. No moon hung overhead, no stars punctured the velvet black, just an endless canopy that pressed down like a heavy wool blanket. The road stretched ahead in a gentle curve, unmarked by any signs or mile markers, flanked by desert scrub that rustled in a wind I couldn't feel through my closed windows. My CB radio crackled with static, occasionally catching fragments of distant conversations that faded before I could make sense of the words. I'd pulled off I-80 around 11:30, following what my GPS insisted was a shortcut to Reno. The screen showed my destination was only 40 miles away, but I'd been driving for over an hour now, maintaining a steady 65 miles per hour. The math didn't add up, but fatigue played tricks on perception sometimes. Maybe I dozed off without realizing it, lost time in those microsecond lapses that plagued drivers on long hauls. The thermos beside me held lukewarm coffee that tasted like burnt rubber, but I drank it anyway, needing the caffeine more than flavor. That's when I first noticed the tree. It appeared suddenly in my peripheral vision, a massive cottonwood that seemed impossibly old and gnarled, its trunk thick as a grain silo, Spanish moss draped from its branches like tattered curtains, swaying in that unfelt wind. The tree stood alone in a small clearing perhaps 50 yards off the road's right shoulder, illuminated by what appeared to be moonlight despite the starless sky above. Something about it drew my attention, made me slow the truck slightly to get a better look. The tree's bark was pale, almost white in the strange light, covered in what looked like carved symbols or maybe just natural weathering patterns. Its canopy spread wide and full, creating a circle of deep shadow beneath. As my headlights swept past, I thought I saw something hanging from one of the lower branches, something that swayed with more purpose than the moss, but the angle changed too quickly for me to be sure. I pressed the accelerator and continued down the road, but the image lingered. There had been something unsettling about that tree, something that didn't belong in the Nevada desert. Cottonwoods needed water, lots of it, and grew primarily in lower elevations near rivers and streams. This was high desert country, dry and harsh, not suitable for such vegetation. Yet the tree had looked healthy, vibrant even, its leaves rustling with life. The road curved gently to the left, then right again, following what seemed like a natural meandering path through the landscape. My odometer clicked off the miles steadily, but the GPS showed my destination growing no closer. If anything, the remaining distance seemed to be increasing. 42 miles now, when it had shown 40 an hour ago. I tapped the screen, thinking it might be frozen, but the little blue dot continued moving along the highlighted route. The radio static grew louder, sometimes resolving into what sounded like voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. Occasionally I caught fragments in English, always the same phrase repeated in different tones and cadences. Around the tree, around the tree, around the tree. I reached to adjust the squelch, but the words faded back into white noise before I could isolate the frequency. 20 minutes later, I saw the tree again. This time I was certain it was the same one. The distinctive pale bark, the unusual spread of branches, the way the moss hung like funeral shrouds. It stood in exactly the same position relative to the road, 50 yards off the right shoulder in its circle of inexplicable moonlight. But this was impossible. I hadn't turned around, hadn't made any sharp turns or navigated any intersections. The road had curved and meandered, yes, but generally in a westward direction toward my destination. I pulled the truck to the shoulder and let it idle, staring out at the tree through my passenger window. The shapes in its branches were clearer now, and my stomach tightened as I realized what I was looking at. Dozens of objects hung from the cottonwood's limbs, suspended by what appeared to be rope or chain. Some were clearly recognizable as road signs, their reflective surfaces catching the pale light. Others looked like license plates, twisted and bent. A few appeared to be larger objects, possibly bumpers or pieces of automotive trim. The CB radio crackled, and a voice emerged from the static, clear and close. "You seeing it too, driver?" I grabbed the microphone with hands that trembled slightly. "Who is this? Where are you?" "Been circling for 3 hours now," the voice replied. It belonged to a woman, middle-aged by the sound of it, with a slight southern accent. "Same damn tree every time. Radio says I'm on Route 95, but that can't be right." "This is Marcus in the blue Kenworth," I transmitted. "I'm seeing the same tree. GPS has me on some unmarked road, supposedly a shortcut to Reno." "Sarah in the red Peterbilt," came the reply. "Was heading to Las Vegas when my GPS routed me off the interstate." "How long you been on this road?" I checked my dashboard clock. Nearly 2 hours now since I'd left I-80. "Too long," I said. "Something's wrong here. This road doesn't make sense." "Tell me about it, hun." "I've been keeping track of the miles since I first saw that tree. Driven over 150 miles, but according to my GPS, I'm exactly where I started." The radio fell silent for a moment. Then another voice joined the conversation, this one belonging to an older man with a gravelly voice weathered by years of cigarettes and diesel fumes. "Y'all talking about the cottonwood with all the junk hanging from it? Been past that thing 6 times now. Dame's Earl driving the yellow Mac. 6 times? Sarah's voice rose slightly. "How long you been out here, Earl?" "Since yesterday afternoon. Fuel gauge hasn't moved much, though, which is mighty strange. Should have run dry hours ago." I looked at my own fuel gauge and felt a chill run down my spine. 3/4 full, exactly where it had been when I'd left the truck stop in Elko. I'd been driving for hours on a route that should have consumed at least a 1/4 tank, but the needle hadn't budged. The tree seemed to pulse in the strange light, its hanging collection of automotive debris swaying in patterns that defied the gentle desert breeze. I could make out more details now that I was stationary. Some of the objects were clearly old, their metal surfaces dulled by oxidation and weather. Others appeared newer, still bearing traces of paint and chrome. All of them seemed to be pieces taken from trucks and other commercial vehicles. "We need to get off this road," I said into the microphone. "Try turning around, heading back the way we came." "Already tried that twice," Earl replied. "Road just curves back around to the tree. It's like we're stuck on some kind of loop." I put the truck in gear and eased back onto the asphalt. my headlights sweeping across the desert landscape. The road ahead looked identical to the road behind, a ribbon of dark pavement that curved through the scrubland with no apparent beginning or end. My speedometer showed 65. The engine maintained its steady rhythm, but something fundamental had changed about the journey. Time seemed elastic, distance meaningless. The next time I passed the tree, I was ready for it. I slowed the truck to a crawl and studied the collection hanging from its branches. Definitely license plates from various states, road signs warning of curves and grade changes, pieces of mud flaps and bumpers, and what looked like CB antennas. Everything a long-haul driver might lose or discard during years on the road, all gathered here like some bizarre shrine to the trucking life. But there was something else, something that made my hands grip the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. Hanging from the lowest branch, swaying with deliberate motion, was a blue Kenworth emblem identical to the one mounted on my hood. "Sarah, Earl, you still out there?" I called into the radio. "Still here, Marcus," Sarah replied. "Just past the tree again." "Seventh time now. Look closer at what's hanging there. Really look." The radio was quiet for several long minutes, then Earl's voice came back, shaky and uncertain. "Jesus Christ." "The night frequency," from Marcus Webb. The CB radio crackled to life at exactly 11:47 p.m., just as I was settling into the rhythm of Interstate 80's endless black ribbon stretching toward the Nevada border. I'd been driving this route for 12 years, hauling everything from auto parts to frozen goods across the American heartland, and I thought I knew every dispatcher's voice from here to Sacramento. But the woman who came through my speakers that night spoke with a cadence I'd never heard before, smooth as honey over gravel, asking questions that made the hair on my arms stand up beneath my flannel sleeves. "Evening, driver," she purred through the static, her voice riding the airwaves like smoke. "This is Night Control. Can you confirm your current position and cargo manifest?" I reached for my handset, thumb finding the familiar worn groove on the talk button. "Standard procedure, nothing unusual there. Night Control, this is Big Blue northbound on I-80, mile marker 214. Hauling refrigerated pharmaceuticals, destination Reno. Over." The response came back immediately, too immediately, as if she'd been waiting for my exact words. "Copy that, Big Blue. Beautiful night for a drive, isn't it? Tell me, Marcus, do you ever wonder what happens to drivers who take the wrong exit?" The way she said my name sent ice water through my veins. I hadn't given her my name, and dispatcher protocol never called for using drivers' first names unless there was an emergency. I glanced at my CB display, but it showed only static where the channel identification should have been. Outside my windshield, the Nevada desert stretched away on both sides, empty and vast under a canopy of stars that suddenly seemed too bright, too close. "Come again, Night Control?" I didn't copy that transmission clearly. Her laugh drifted through the speakers like wind through a graveyard. "Oh, I think you heard me just fine, Marcus. Let me ask you something else. When you close your eyes at night in that sleeper cab, do you ever feel like you're not alone? Like there's someone watching you breathe?" I felt my hands tighten on the steering wheel, knuckles going white against the black leather grip. The engine of my Peterbilt hummed its familiar song beneath me. 18 wheels eating up asphalt with mechanical precision. But something had changed in the cab's atmosphere. The air felt thicker, charged with an electricity that made my skin crawl. I'd been driving solo for years, comfortable with solitude and the endless highway meditation, but now the emptiness around me felt different, alive with unseen presence. "Listen, Night Control, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I need to maintain radio discipline out here. If you have legitimate dispatch information, please transmit it. Otherwise, I'm switching to Channel 19. Don't do that. Marcus." Her voice had changed, dropping to a whisper that somehow cut through the road noise and engine rumble with crystal clarity. "I have so many more questions for you. Like, have you ever noticed how your odometer sometimes shows miles you don't remember driving? How sometimes you arrive at destinations with no memory of the last 100 miles of road. The question hit me like a physical blow because it was true. Had always been true on these long-haul runs. Every trucker experienced it. That hypnotic state where the miles disappeared beneath your wheels and time became fluid, elastic. Highway hypnosis, the old-timers called it. Nothing supernatural about it, but hearing her describe it in that silk-wrapped voice made it sound sinister. Wrong somehow. I checked my mirrors, scanning the darkness behind me for other vehicles, but saw only the red glow of my own taillights reflected back from the empty road. No other traffic, no lights on the horizon except for the distant glow of some small desert town, whose name I couldn't remember. The GPS on my dashboard showed my position as a blue dot crawling along a thin line, but the estimated arrival time kept flickering between different numbers, as if the system couldn't decide where I was supposed to be going. "How about this one, Marcus?" The dispatcher's voice continued, each word dripping with false sweetness. "Do you ever wonder why you always take the same routes, make the same stops, meet the same people over and over again? Don't you find that strange? Don't you ever want to know what would happen if you just kept driving, past your destination, past the edge of the map, into those places where the road signs stop making sense?" I fumbled for my logbook, flipping through pages of delivery records and fuel receipts, trying to ground myself in the familiar routine of paperwork and regulations. But as I scanned the entries, a chill crept up my spine like spider legs. The dates were wrong, jumping around in no logical sequence. Tuesday, October 15th, then September 3rd, then November 27th. Some of the destinations I'd supposedly delivered to weren't even real places, just combinations of letters that looked like town names but meant nothing when I tried to remember actually being there. "You're starting to understand, aren't you?" the dispatcher whispered, her voice now seeming to come from inside my own head rather than through the radio speakers. "You're beginning to remember what you've been trying so hard to forget. Tell me, Marcus, what was the last thing you remember clearly? Not the driving, not the deliveries, but something real, something that actually happened to you?" I tried to focus on the question, reaching back through my memories like a man groping through fog. There had been, what? A truck stop in Kansas, coffee and pie at 3 in the morning, a conversation with another driver about his daughter's wedding, a phone call to my ex-wife about Christmas plans. But when I tried to pin down the details, they slipped away like water through my fingers. The other driver's face was a blur. The truck stop could have been any truck stop. The phone call might never have happened at all. "That's right," she purred, reading my confusion like words on a page. "Keep thinking back, Marcus. Past the endless highways and anonymous motels, past the cargo manifests and fuel calculations. What's the last real thing you remember?" The road ahead began to shimmer, heat waves rising from asphalt even though the desert night was cool enough to require my jacket. My headlights caught something moving in the distance, a figure standing beside the interstate, thumb extended in the universal hitchhiker's gesture. As I drew closer, I could see it was a woman in a dispatcher's uniform, headset around her neck, clipboard in her hand. She was smiling, but her smile was too wide, her eyes too bright in my high beams. "Pull over, Marcus," the voice commanded, no longer pretending to be friendly. "We have so much more to discuss, so many questions I haven't asked yet. Like why your truck registration expired 5 years ago. Like why the pharmaceutical company you're supposedly delivering for went out of business in 2018. Like why your CDL shows a photo of a man who died in a highway accident outside of Barstow on a night very much like this one." My foot found the brake pedal, but instead of slowing down, the truck seemed to accelerate. The speedometer needle climbed past 80, past 90, the engine roaring with a sound like tortured souls. The figure beside the road grew larger as I approached, and I could see now that her dispatcher's uniform was torn and stained with something dark, her clipboard covered with writing in a language I didn't recognize. "Stop fighting it," she called through the radio, her voice mixing with the sound of wind and road noise. You've been running from this conversation for so long, Marcus. Running from the questions you're afraid to answer. But the road always brings you back to me, doesn't it? The same route, the same destination, the same terrible understanding that you can never quite reach. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the left, sending the truck into the opposite lane, tires screaming against asphalt as I fought to avoid the figure by the roadside. In my mirrors, I caught a glimpse of her turning to watch me pass, her smile never wavering, her eyes following my trailer as it swayed and settled back into the right lane. The CB radio erupted with static, and what sounded like dozens of voices all talking at once, asking questions I couldn't understand in languages I'd never heard. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything went quiet. The radio fell silent, my speedometer dropped back to legal limits, and the road ahead looked like every other stretch of Interstate 80 I'd driven 10,000 times before. Normal, safe, real. But in my logbook, a new entry had appeared in handwriting I didn't recognize. Delivery completed. Return to dispatch for new assignment. Questions pending. I'm still driving, still hauling cargo to destinations that might not exist. Still listening for that voice on the CB radio. Sometimes in truck stops and diners, I hear other drivers talking about dispatchers who ask the wrong questions, who know things they shouldn't know, who keep you on the road long after you should have arrived home. We never talk about it directly. The Breathing Walls. From Jake Mendoza. The thing about driving long haul is that your truck becomes more than just a machine after a while. It becomes your home, your sanctuary, your entire world rolling down endless ribbons of asphalt under star-scattered skies. I've been pulling freight across the continental United States for nearly 15 years now, and in all that time I've never had a rig quite like my current Peterbilt. She's a 2019 model with all the modern conveniences, including a spacious sleeper cab that's practically a small apartment on wheels, climate control, memory foam mattress, plenty of storage, even a small refrigerator and microwave. Everything a driver could want for those mandatory rest periods that keep us all safe on the roads. I picked up this particular truck from a dealer in Memphis about 8 months ago. The previous owner had put barely 60,000 miles on her before trading up to something newer, and the price was too good to pass up. The dealer mentioned that the original driver had complained about some minor issues with the sleeper compartment. Nothing mechanical, just some odd noises that the service department could never quite track down. Said it was probably just the air conditioning system settling, or maybe some loose paneling that would tighten up once the truck got properly broken in. I didn't think much of it at the time. Every truck has its quirks, its own personality that you learn to live with. The first few months on the road were perfect. The Peterbilt handled like a dream. Fuel economy was better than expected, and the sleeper was comfortable enough that I actually looked forward to my 10-hour breaks. But somewhere around the 5th month, I started noticing something that struck me as odd, though not particularly alarming at first. When I would settle into the bunk for the night, usually exhausted after 11 hours of fighting traffic and weather, I would sometimes hear what sounded like very faint breathing coming from somewhere within the walls of the sleeper compartment. Now, I want to be clear about something. The human ear can play tricks on you, especially when you're tired and surrounded by the constant low-level mechanical sounds that every truck makes. The refrigerator cycling on and off, the air conditioning compressor, the subtle creaks and settling noises as metal expands and contracts with temperature changes. It's easy to let your imagination turn these familiar sounds into something more mysterious than they actually are. So at first, I just attributed the breathing sounds to some combination of these normal mechanical functions and went on with my routine. But the breathing sounds gradually became more distinct over the following weeks. Not louder exactly, but somehow more defined, more rhythmic, more unmistakably biological in nature. It was the kind of deep, slow breathing you might hear from someone in the early stages of sleep, just beginning to drift off. The rhythm was perfectly steady, almost hypnotic in its consistency. In through the nose, a brief pause. Out through slightly parted lips, another pause, then the cycle would repeat. Sometimes I would lie there in the darkness and find my own breathing unconsciously matching that mysterious rhythm, which created an oddly unsettling sense of connection to whatever was producing the sound. The breathing seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as if the very structure of the sleeper compartment had somehow developed lungs. I tried everything I could think of to locate the source. I pressed my ear against different sections of the interior paneling, checked all the vents and access panels, even crawled underneath the truck with a flashlight to examine the underside of the sleeper compartment. Everything appeared completely normal. No loose connections, no gaps where outside air might create unusual sounds, no signs of any kind of infestation that might produce rhythmic noises. The truck was mechanically sound in every way I could measure. I considered taking it to a service department to have them investigate, but I honestly couldn't figure out how to describe the problem in a way that wouldn't make me sound like I was losing my mind. How do you explain to a mechanic that your truck appears to be breathing? They would check the obvious things like airline connections and HVAC components, find nothing wrong, and send me on my way with a bill for diagnostic time. So I decided to just live with it and see if the sounds eventually went away on their own. Instead, they got more pronounced. By the 7th month, the breathing had become impossible to ignore. It would start up almost as soon as I turned off the engine and settled into the bunk for my mandatory rest period. The rhythm never varied, never skipped a beat, never showed any signs of the irregularities you would expect from actual mechanical systems cycling on and off. It was steady as a metronome, deep and slow like someone lost in profound sleep. Sometimes I would hold my own breath and listen intently, trying to convince myself that I was somehow hearing the echo of my own respiratory sounds bouncing off the interior surfaces in some acoustically strange way. But the breathing would continue even when my lungs were completely still, following its own mysterious cadence. The really unnerving part was how the temperature in the sleeper compartment seemed to fluctuate in sync with the breathing sounds. During the inhalation phase, the air would become slightly warmer and more humid, as if I were inside some vast lung that was drawing in breath. During the exhalation, things would cool down just a degree or two, and the humidity would drop. The changes were subtle enough that I might have imagined them, but they were consistent enough that I started paying close attention with a small digital thermometer. Sure enough, the temperature swings correlated perfectly with the breathing rhythm. 1 or 2 degrees up during inhalation, back down during exhalation, over and over throughout the night. Last week, I was parked at a truck stop outside of Flagstaff, Arizona, trying to get some sleep before making the final push to Los Angeles with a load of electronics. It was one of those crisp desert nights where the temperature drops 40 degrees after sunset, and the stars look close enough to reach up and pluck from the sky. I had been lying in the bunk for about an hour, listening to the now familiar breathing sounds and watching the small thermometer display cycle through its predictable pattern of temperature changes. The rhythm was particularly pronounced that night, deeper and more resonant than usual, as if whatever was producing it had been running hard and needed more oxygen. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The breathing was no longer quite synchronized with the temperature changes. For months they had matched perfectly, inhalation corresponding with warming, exhalation with cooling. But now there was a slight lag, as if the heating and cooling were taking a moment to catch up with the respiratory rhythm. It was subtle, maybe a second or two of delay, but it was definitely there, and somehow that tiny discrepancy made everything feel much more ominous, as if whatever system had been producing these effects was starting to malfunction or evolve in some unexpected direction. I sat up in the bunk and pressed my ear against the wall where the sound seemed strongest. The breathing was definitely more labored than usual, with a slight wheeze on the exhalation that I had never noticed before. It reminded me of someone with a chest cold or maybe early-stage pneumonia, that wet, congested quality that makes every breath sound like work. As I listened more intently, I began to pick up other sounds that had previously been masked by the steady respiratory rhythm. Faint creaking noises that sounded almost like joints flexing, soft rustling sounds like fabric brushing against fabric, and underneath it all, something that might have been a very slow heartbeat. I grabbed a flashlight and started examining every square inch of the sleeper compartment interior, running my hands along the wall panels and checking for any kind of vibration or movement that might explain what I was hearing. The breathing sounds continued throughout my search, sometimes seeming to come from directly behind whatever section of wall I was examining, other times appearing to shift to a different location entirely. It was as if the source was moving around within the walls, or as if the walls themselves had become some kind of vast respiratory organ. When I pressed my palm flat against the panel where the sound seemed strongest, I could swear I felt a very subtle expansion and contraction, perfectly timed with the breathing rhythm. The movement was barely perceptible, maybe a millimeter or two, but it was definitely there. The wall was moving in and out like the side of some enormous chest, rising and falling with each breath. I snatched my hand back as if I had touched something hot, my heart suddenly hammering in my chest as the full implications of what I was experiencing began to sink in. I spent the rest of that night sitting in the driver's seat with all the interior lights on, afraid to return to the bunk where I could feel those slow, steady breaths continuing their mysterious cycle. When dawn finally broke over the Arizona mountains, the breathing sounds gradually faded away, as they always did when daylight returned. But I knew they would be back as soon as I tried to sleep again, probably stronger and more pronounced than before. I delivered my load in Los Angeles and immediately started looking for a different truck. But the process of making a change is complicated when you're an owner-operator. There's financing to consider, insurance transfers, all kinds of paperwork and logistics that take time to arrange. The Grinning Glass, from Marcus Chen. The first thing you learn about long-haul trucking is that your windshield becomes your window to the world, and sometimes that world stares back at you in ways you never expected. I've been driving freight across the interstate for nearly 15 years now, piloting my '08 Peterbilt through rain and snow, desert heat and mountain fog, but nothing prepared me for what happened on that October night somewhere between Bakersfield and Barstow. The evening had started routine enough. I'd loaded up with a shipment of electronics bound for Phoenix, the kind of cargo that pays well but comes with tight deadlines. The dispatcher had been clear about the delivery window, so I was pushing through the night rather than taking my usual rest stop in Mojave. The desert stretched out before me like a dark ocean, punctuated only by the occasional cluster of truck stop lights or the distant glow of some small town that existed primarily to serve travelers like myself. My CB radio crackled with the familiar chatter of other drivers, discussing weather conditions ahead and speed trap warnings. But as the hours wore on, even those voices began to fade. The deeper you drive into the Mojave at night, the more isolated you become, as if the desert swallows radio signals along with everything else. The steady thrum of my diesel engine provided a hypnotic soundtrack, and the yellow lines of the highway disappeared beneath my hood in an endless rhythm. It was around 2 in the morning when I first noticed the small crack in my windshield. Just a tiny spider web of lines near the bottom right corner, the kind of minor damage that happens when a pebble kicks up from the road. I made a mental note to get it repaired once I reached Phoenix, knowing that small cracks have a tendency to spread if left untreated. The desert temperature changes alone could turn a minor annoyance into a major problem. The crack seemed innocuous at first, barely visible unless I shifted in my seat and caught it in the right light. But as I continued driving through the empty desert, I found my eyes drifting toward it more frequently. There was something about its shape that seemed almost deliberate, as if the glass hadn't simply fractured randomly but had been carved with intention. The lines curved in a way that reminded me of something familiar, though I couldn't quite place what. Miles passed beneath my wheels, marked only by the occasional road sign emerging from the darkness and disappearing just as quickly. The desert night pressed against my windows like a living thing, and I found myself grateful for the warm glow of my dashboard lights and the steady presence of my CB radio, even though it had fallen mostly silent. The isolation of night driving can play tricks on your mind if you let it, turning shadows into movement and silence into whispers. When I glanced at the crack again, it seemed to have grown slightly. Not dramatically, but enough that I was certain it hadn't been quite so pronounced an hour earlier. The pattern of lines had extended just a bit, creating what looked almost like the beginning of a curve at one end. I told myself it was normal for windshield damage to spread gradually, especially with the constant vibration of highway driving, but something about the precise way it was developing made me uneasy. The highway ahead remained empty of other traffic, which wasn't unusual for this stretch of desert at this hour, but the solitude felt more oppressive than normal. My headlights carved a cone of visibility through the darkness, illuminating the weathered asphalt and the occasional piece of roadside debris. But beyond that circle of light, the world might as well have ceased to exist. The stars above provided little comfort, appearing cold and distant against the vast black sky. As I reached for my thermos of coffee, movement in my peripheral vision made me look back at the windshield crack. What I saw made my hands tighten involuntarily on the steering wheel. The crack had definitely grown, and its shape was now unmistakably familiar. The spiderweb of lines had organized itself into what could only be described as the beginning of a smile. A curved line with smaller fractures radiating outward like the creases that form around a mouth when someone grins. I pulled over at the next wide spot in the shoulder, leaving my engine running while I got out to examine the windshield from the outside. The desert air hit me with surprising coolness after the warmth of the cab, and the silence was so complete that I could hear the ticking of my engine cooling and the distant sound of wind moving across the open landscape. Walking around to the front of my truck, I played my flashlight beam across the windshield surface. From the outside, the crack was barely visible, just a faint pattern of lines that could have been caused by anything. But when I climbed back into the driver's seat and looked at it from the inside, the smile-shaped fracture seemed almost to glow in the dashboard lights. The curve was more pronounced now, with additional lines that looked disturbingly like teeth marks or the kind of creases that appear when someone smiles with genuine amusement. I considered calling dispatch to report the windshield damage, but explaining that my glass was cracking into the shape of a smile seemed like an invitation for them to order a drug test. Instead, I decided to push through to Phoenix and deal with it in daylight, when things would hopefully seem more rational. The cargo needed to be delivered on time, and I'd driven with worse windshield damage before. Pulling back onto the highway, I tried to focus on the road ahead rather than the growing pattern in my peripheral vision. But the crack seemed determined to capture my attention, and each time I glanced at it, the smile appeared more complete, more deliberate. The lines were spreading with what seemed like purpose, creating not just a curved mouth but the suggestion of expression, as if my windshield was slowly developing a face. The miles crawled by with agonizing slowness. What should have been a routine drive through familiar territory had become an exercise in psychological endurance. Every time I looked at the crack, it seemed to have progressed a little further, the smile growing wider and more defined. The pattern of fractures was beginning to suggest not just a mouth but the area around it, with lines that could almost be interpreted as the creases around eyes. When another truck finally appeared in my mirrors, approaching from behind with its own cone of headlight illumination, I felt a wave of relief at no longer being alone on the highway. But as the driver pulled alongside me in the passing lane, I saw him glance over at my cab and then accelerate quickly past, as if something he'd seen had made him eager to get away. Through his passenger window as he passed, I caught a glimpse of his face, and his expression looked distinctly unsettled. After he disappeared ahead of me, swallowed by the darkness beyond my headlight reach, I began to wonder what he might have seen. From outside my truck, was there something visible that I couldn't perceive from within the cab? The thought made me increasingly uncomfortable, and I found myself checking my mirrors more frequently, hoping for the appearance of other traffic while simultaneously dreading what other drivers might observe. The crack continued its relentless progression across my windshield, and by the time I saw the distant glow of Barstow's lights on the horizon, the smile was nearly complete. The fracture lines had formed a clear curved mouth that stretched almost 6 inches across the glass, with smaller radiating cracks that gave it dimension and character. Most disturbing of all, additional fractures above the smile were beginning to suggest eyes, 2 roughly circular areas where the glass seemed to be developing a different kind of damage entirely. As I drove through Barstow's sleeping streets, past darkened gas stations and closed diners, the smile in my windshield seemed to reflect the sparse streetlights in a way that made it appear almost luminous. The pattern had taken on a life of its own, no longer just a random arrangement of cracks, but something that looked deliberately crafted, as if my windshield was slowly transforming into a face that watched the road ahead with growing amusement. The final stretch to Phoenix passed in a blur of mounting anxiety and forced concentration on driving. I kept my eyes fixed on the highway ahead, but the smile in my windshield had grown so pronounced that I could see it clearly in my peripheral vision, a constant grinning presence that seemed to grow more amused with each passing mile. By the time I reached the Phoenix freight terminal as dawn was breaking over the desert, the crack had formed a complete face, with a wide smile and 2 circular areas that looked disturbingly like eyes staring out at the morning traffic. I delivered my cargo without incident and drove immediately to a truck service center to have the windshield replaced. The mechanic who examined the damage spent a long time studying the pattern of cracks, taking photographs and calling over his colleagues to look at what he described as the most unusual windshield failure he'd ever encountered. They all agreed that they'd never seen glass fracture in such a systematic way, creating what appeared to be a deliberate design rather than random damage. When I picked up my truck with its new windshield later that day, I felt enormous relief at having a clear, unmarked view of the road ahead. The service manager mentioned that they'd kept the old windshield for documentation purposes. The highway that counts backwards, from Jake Morrison. The thing about driving freight across the Midwest is that you learn to trust the mile markers more than your GPS. Those little green signs become your best friends on the endless stretches of Interstate 80, especially when you're pulling a 40-foot trailer loaded with auto parts from Chicago to Denver. Each marker tells you exactly where you are, exactly how far you've traveled, and most importantly, exactly how much road lies ahead before you can pull into a truck stop and grab some decent coffee. I'd been driving the same route for 8 years, knew every marker from the Illinois state line clear through to Colorado. Mile marker 126 meant I was coming up on that truck stop with the good pie. Mile marker 98 warned me about the construction zone that had been going on for 3 summers straight. Mile marker 67 told me I was halfway through Nebraska, and mile marker 23 meant I could start looking forward to crossing into Colorado within the hour. The night everything changed started out ordinary enough. I'd pulled out of the Flying J just outside Des Moines around 11 p.m., my logbook showing I had plenty of drive time left to make good progress before my mandatory rest break. The weather was perfect for night driving, clear skies with just enough of a breeze to keep the air fresh through my cracked window. My CB was quiet, which usually meant smooth sailing ahead, and the steady hum of my Peterbilt's engine was hitting that sweet spot where everything's running exactly as it should. I remember passing mile marker 312 and thinking about how the numbers would start dropping soon as I crossed into Nebraska. There's something satisfying about watching those markers count down, like a reverse odometer tracking your progress across the country. Each number means you're 1 mile closer to your destination, 1 mile closer to home, 1 mile deeper into the rhythm of the open road. But when I passed the next marker, something felt off. The green reflective sign caught my headlights just like always, but instead of showing 311, it read 314. I figured maybe I'd misread the previous one. Maybe I was getting more tired than I thought. Night driving can play tricks on your eyes, especially when you've been staring at the same stretch of asphalt for hours. The engine's steady rumble was almost hypnotic, and the gentle sway of the trailer behind me had settled into that comfortable rhythm that could lull you into a trance if you weren't careful. 5 miles later, I passed marker 317, then 321, then 325. Each sign was climbing higher instead of counting down toward the state line like they should have been. I checked my GPS, but it showed me exactly where I was supposed to be, moving west on I-80 at a steady 65 miles per hour. According to the satellite, I was still in Iowa, still heading in the right direction, still making good time, but the mile markers kept climbing. I tried the CB radio, switching through the channels to see if any other drivers were seeing the same thing. Channel 19 was dead quiet, which was unusual for this stretch of highway. Usually you could count on hearing at least some chatter from other truckers, complaints about traffic or weather updates, or just friendly conversation to pass the miles. Tonight there was nothing but static and the occasional burst of interference that sounded almost like whispered voices, speaking words I couldn't quite make out. Mile marker 334 passed by my window, its reflective surface catching my headlights and throwing the numbers back at me with that familiar green glow. I was definitely moving forward, the broken white lines of the highway disappearing steadily under my hood. But somehow the markers were telling me I was traveling deeper into Iowa instead of getting closer to Nebraska. The landscape outside looked exactly as it should, flat farmland stretching away into darkness on both sides, but those numbers kept climbing in the wrong direction. I pulled out my atlas, the old paper kind that never needs batteries or satellite signals. According to the map, mile marker 334 should have been somewhere back near the Mississippi River, almost 200 miles behind me, but I'd been driving west for hours, watching the fuel gauge drop steadily as my engine consumed diesel at its normal rate. Physics said I had to be moving forward, but the mile markers were insisting I was somehow traveling backward through space. The strangest part was how normal everything else felt. My speedometer held steady at 65. The center line kept disappearing under my bumper at exactly the rate it should. When I passed the occasional overpass or exit ramp, they matched perfectly with what I expected to see on this stretch of highway. It was only the mile markers that had gone insane, climbing higher and higher like some cosmic odometer spinning in reverse. Mile marker 342 flashed past, then 348, then 355. I started doing calculations in my head, trying to figure out how fast I'd have to be moving backward to account for the numbers I was seeing, but my speedometer never wavered, and the landscape kept flowing past my windows in the right direction. Fence posts and cornfields moved from ahead of me to behind me, just like they always did. Only those green signs seemed to exist in some alternative version of reality, where east was west and forward was backward. When I saw mile marker 367 approaching in my headlights, I made the decision to pull over at the next rest area. I needed to stop, check my equipment, maybe call dispatch and report some kind of navigation malfunction. The exit ramp appeared exactly where it should have been, leading to a small rest stop with the usual amenities, picnic tables, vending machines, and enough space for a few trucks to park safely off the interstate. But when I pulled into the parking area and shut down my engine, the sudden silence felt wrong. Not just quiet, but actively empty, like the sound had been sucked out of the air around me. Even with the engine off, I should have been able to hear something. Wind through the trees, insects, maybe the distant hum of traffic on the interstate. Instead, there was nothing but a hollow absence of sound that made my ears ring. I climbed down from the cab and walked around my truck, checking the tires and lights, making sure everything looked normal. The trailer was still properly coupled, the load still secure behind the locked doors. My fuel tanks read exactly what they should after driving for several hours at highway speeds. Everything was exactly as it should be, except for those impossible mile markers. Standing there in the rest area, I could see the interstate stretching away in both directions, illuminated by the occasional streetlight. The pavement looked normal. The lane markings were exactly where they belonged, and I could even see the telltale reflective glow of another mile marker about half a mile to the west. But when I climbed back into my cab and started the engine, I had the strangest feeling that driving toward that next marker would only take me further into whatever strange loop I'd stumbled into. Sure enough, when I pulled back onto the highway and reached the next sign, it read 371. The pavement beneath my tires felt solid and real. The steering wheel responded normally to every adjustment, and my transmission shifted through the gears exactly as it always did. But somehow I was traveling deeper and deeper into a version of Iowa that shouldn't have existed, following mile markers that counted upward into mathematical impossibility. The fuel gauge became my anchor to reality. It kept dropping at the normal rate, proving that I was burning diesel, moving forward, covering actual distance. But distance toward what? If the mile markers were right, I was driving toward the heart of Iowa, getting further and further from my destination with every mile. If my compass and GPS were right, I was heading west toward Nebraska just like I should be. Both couldn't be true, but I was trapped in a reality where both seemed to be happening simultaneously. Mile marker 389 passed by, then 394, then 401. The numbers climbed higher and higher, each one taking me further into impossible territory. According to these signs, I was now driving through parts of Iowa that existed somewhere beyond the eastern edge of the map. Phantom miles that stretched into mathematical impossibility. Then I started noticing the other trucks. They appeared in my mirrors first. Headlights that matched my speed exactly, staying the same distance behind no matter how much I adjusted my velocity. When I sped up to 70, they sped up too. When I dropped back to 60, they dropped back as well. The lights never got closer and never fell behind, maintaining perfect formation like some kind of convoy I'd never agreed to join. I tried the CB again, keying the microphone and calling out to anyone who might be listening. Breaker 19, this is the blue Peterbilt westbound on I-80. Anybody out there seeing mile markers that don't make sense? Nothing came back except static and that strange interference that almost sounded like voices. But the headlights in my mirrors kept pace, and I started to wonder if those other drivers were trapped in the same impossible loop, following the same backwards mile markers toward destinations that might not exist. Mile marker 412 flashed past, its green numbers glowing in my headlights like some kind of accusation. I'd been driving for what felt like hours since leaving the rest stop, but my fuel gauge had barely moved. The pulse of Highway 13. From Marcus Holloway. The GPS unit had been acting strange for 3 days straight, ever since I picked it up from that roadside electronics dealer outside Bakersfield. The old man running the place had these milky eyes that never quite looked at you directly, and when he handed me the device, his fingers lingered on mine just a moment too long. Said it was a special model, discontinued years ago, but still the most accurate navigation system ever made. The price was too good to pass down, especially for an independent trucker like me, who couldn't afford the fancy new equipment. Now, rolling through the Nevada desert at 2 a.m. with nothing but sagebrush and darkness stretching endlessly in every direction, I was beginning to understand why he'd been so eager to let it go. The screen flickered with an unusual amber light that seemed almost organic, casting strange shadows across the cab of my Peterbilt. The route it had chosen wasn't the one I'd programmed in, taking me down progressively smaller highways until I found myself on this narrow strip of cracked asphalt that my paper atlas didn't even acknowledge existed. The device sat mounted on my dashboard, its screen displaying what should have been a normal road map, but something about it made my skin crawl. The lines representing roads seemed to pulse faintly, like veins carrying blood through some vast circulatory system. At first I'd chalked it up to eye strain and too much coffee, but the longer I stared at it, the more convinced I became that the map was somehow alive. My headlights cut through the desert night, illuminating the occasional Joshua tree or abandoned mile marker, but mostly just empty roads stretching toward a horizon I couldn't see. The engine hummed its familiar diesel lullaby, a sound that usually comforted me during these long hauls, but tonight it seemed muffled, as if the very air around my truck had thickened. The radio had given up trying to find a signal hours ago, leaving me alone with the whisper of wind against the cab and that strange amber glow from the GPS. Highway 13, according to the device, though I'd never heard of such a route in this part of Nevada. The road surface was smooth enough, recently paved it seemed, but there were no other vehicles, no signs of civilization beyond the asphalt itself. Just mile after mile of desert that felt increasingly hostile, as if the landscape itself was watching my progress with something approaching hunger. That's when I first noticed the beating. It started as just a subtle rhythm, barely perceptible beneath the steady rumble of the engine. I might have dismissed it as some minor mechanical issue, perhaps a fan belt beginning to wear, but something made me glance down at the GPS screen. The map pulsed in perfect synchronization with the sound, the road lines expanding and contracting like arteries responding to a heartbeat. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I realized the rhythm matched my own pulse exactly. The amber light grew brighter, and I could see more detail in the strange cartography displayed on the screen. What I had initially taken for standard highway markers now revealed themselves as something far more unsettling. Small symbols dotted the route ahead, icons that looked disturbingly organic. They resembled tiny hearts, each one pulsing in sequence, creating a wave of movement that seemed to flow toward some distant destination beyond the edge of the display. I reached over to turn off the device, but my finger hesitated above the power button, despite every instinct screaming at me to shut the thing down and rely on my paper maps. I found myself paralyzed by a growing certainty that the GPS was showing me something important, something I needed to see. The beating grew stronger, no longer just audible but now vibrating through the truck's frame, making the coffee in my thermos ripple with each pulse. The road began to curve, following contours that the GPS predicted with eerie precision. Each turn was marked on the screen seconds before it appeared in my headlights, as if the device wasn't just navigating the highway, but somehow connected to it on a fundamental level. The pulsing of the map grew more intense, and I noticed that the color was shifting from amber to a deeper, more troubling shade of red. Miles passed in a hypnotic rhythm, the heartbeat of the map keeping time with my own increasingly rapid pulse. I tried to shake off the growing sense of dread, telling myself that it was just suggestion, that the stress of 3 days of strange behavior from the GPS was finally getting to me. But when I looked down at the screen again, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The map was showing more than just roads now. Branching off from the main highway were smaller lines, thin red threads that pulsed and moved like capillaries. They spread out into the surrounding desert, creating an intricate network that looked disturbingly like a circulatory system viewed from above. At the center of this web, perhaps 50 miles ahead, was a large pulsing symbol that could only be described as a heart. My truck crested a small rise, and suddenly the desert around me was no longer empty. Scattered across the landscape were other vehicles, dozens of them, parked at seemingly random locations with their headlights still on. Cars, trucks, motorcycles, all sitting motionless in the sand and scrub, their lights pointing toward the road like the eyes of some vast congregation. The GPS screen showed each one as a small pulsing dot, connected to the main highway by those thin red lines. I wanted to stop, to investigate, to understand what I was seeing, but my foot seemed frozen on the accelerator. The truck continued forward at exactly 55 miles per hour, as if it had developed a will of its own. When I tried to slow down, the engine responded normally, But within moments I found my speed returning to that steady pace without any conscious input from me. The beating was no longer just coming from the GPS, but seemed to emanate from the road itself. I could feel it through the tires, through the seat, through the very air around me. Each pulse sent a wave of vertigo through my system, and I began to notice that my own heartbeat was synchronizing more and more closely with the rhythm. When I tried to consciously alter my pulse to break the connection, a sharp pain shot through my chest that left me gasping. The highway continued its relentless path toward whatever lay at the center of the map, and the GPS screen now showed that I was less than 20 miles from my apparent destination. The image had become so detailed that I could see individual organs within the circulatory system, all of them pulsing in perfect harmony. My truck was represented by a small icon moving along what I now realized was not a highway at all, but the main artery leading to a vast beating heart. Other vehicles began to appear on the road ahead, but they were all parked along the shoulders, empty and silent. Their occupants were nowhere to be seen, though their doors hung open as if the drivers had simply gotten out and walked away into the desert. Each abandoned vehicle was connected to the others by thin red lines on the GPS screen, part of an ever-growing network that seemed to pulse with borrowed life. The road crested another hill, and I could see a glow on the horizon. Not the clean light of a city, but something more organic, something that throbbed and pulsed with the same rhythm as the map on my dashboard. The GPS was no longer showing a traditional display, but had become something like an anatomical diagram, with my truck represented as a small cell moving through what was unmistakably a living cardiovascular system. 10 miles from the center, and I could hear something beyond just the beating. It was a whisper, barely audible above the engine noise, speaking in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. It was calling me home, welcoming me to a place where the boundary between flesh and metal, between driver and destination, would finally dissolve. The GPS screen pulsed brighter with each mile, bathing the interior of my cab in that sick red light. My hands were no longer entirely my own, gripping the steering wheel with a strength that made my knuckles ache. The truck responded to inputs I wasn't consciously making, following the curves of the road with inhuman precision. In the distance, I could see the source of the glow, a massive structure that rose from the desert floor like a biological cathedral, its walls undulating with a rhythm I had come to know all too well. 5 miles out, and the whispers became a chorus, dozens of voices speaking in unison, welcoming me to join their eternal circulation. The GPS no longer showed a map, but had become a window into something vast and alien, something that had been patient enough to wait for the right moment to call in its collectors. I understood then that the device had never been about navigation at all, but about harvesting, about finding those isolated souls traveling the empty highways and drawing them into this massive, living system. The structure ahead was not built but grown, a heart the size of a city block beating with the rhythm of 1,000 absorbed lives. The abandoned vehicles surrounding it were not just empty, but had been somehow incorporated into the mass, their metal frames twisted into arterial shapes that carried unknown fluids between organ-like chambers. The Mother's Bridge, from Jake Hendricks. The first time I heard the overpass sing, I thought it was my radio picking up some distant AM station, the kind that drifts in and out on lonely stretches of interstate like a ghost looking for somewhere to haunt. I was hauling a load of construction equipment from Phoenix to Denver, running the night shift because the desert heat would cook my engine during the day, and my old Peterbilt doesn't have the best cooling system anymore. 23 years I've been driving truck, and you learn to recognize every sound your rig makes, every vibration that travels up through the steering wheel, every whistle the wind makes when it catches your mirrors just right. But this sound was different. Soft and melodic, threading through the steady drone of my diesel engine like silk through burlap. I reached for the radio dial, figuring I'd accidentally bumped it while grabbing my coffee. but the display showed the same classic rock station I always listened to, and it was playing some forgettable song about heartbreak and highways. The singing continued underneath it all, so faint I had to hold my breath to make sure I wasn't imagining things. The highway stretched ahead of me in the amber glow of my headlights, empty except for the occasional set of taillights disappearing over distant hills. New Mexico at 3 in the morning is about as lonely as the world gets. All sagebrush and stars and the kind of silence that makes you feel like the last person on earth. I'd been driving this route for years, knew every mile marker and rest stop, every place where the road curved just enough to make you pay attention. But tonight something felt different, like the familiar had shifted just slightly out of focus. The singing grew clearer as I crested a small hill, and I could make out a melody now, something nostalgic and soothing that reminded me of the lullabies my mother used to hum when I was small and couldn't sleep during thunderstorms. She'd sit on the edge of my bed and run her fingers through my hair, her voice soft and warm in the darkness, making everything safe again. The memory hit me with unexpected force, bringing tears to my eyes that I hadn't shed in decades, not since her funeral when I was barely 18. That's when I saw the overpass ahead, silhouetted against the star-filled sky like a concrete rainbow. It was one of those simple highway bridges that carry a county road over the interstate. Nothing special about it except that it seemed to be glowing faintly in the moonlight, as if the concrete itself was luminescent. As my truck approached, the singing became unmistakably clear. A woman's voice floating down from the bridge above, wordless but achingly beautiful. The kind of melody that burrows into your chest and makes your heart remember things you thought you'd forgotten. I eased off the throttle, letting my rig coast as I passed beneath the overpass, and the singing enveloped my cab like a warm embrace. For just a moment, everything felt perfect and peaceful, like coming home after a long journey, like finding something precious you thought you'd lost forever. The voice seemed to follow me as I emerged on the other side, growing fainter but never quite disappearing, and I found myself humming along without realizing it, my voice rough and unpracticed compared to that ethereal soprano. I should have written it off as fatigue or maybe some trick of acoustics. Wind moving through the concrete in just the right way to create an illusion of music. Lord knows I'd been driving long enough to see plenty of strange things on the road. Mirages that turned out to be nothing more than heat, shimmer, and imagination. But something about that voice stayed with me, haunting the edges of my consciousness like a half-remembered dream, and I caught myself thinking about it during my mandatory rest break, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. The return trip 3 days later took me past the same overpass around midnight, and I found myself slowing down as I approached, listening carefully over the rumble of my empty trailer. The night was clear and cold, with a wind that made my truck rock slightly as it gusted across the highway, but I could hear it again as I drew near the bridge, that same beautiful lullaby drifting down from above. This time I was ready for it, and I rolled down my windows despite the chill, letting the music fill my cab completely. The voice was even clearer now, and I could almost make out words in a language I didn't recognize, something old and melodic that seemed to speak directly to my soul rather than my ears. As I passed under the overpass, I looked up through my windshield and saw a figure standing on the bridge, silhouetted against the stars. It looked like a woman in a flowing dress, her arms outstretched as if embracing the night sky, but she was there for only an instant before I emerged on the other side and she was gone. I pulled over at the next truck stop and called my dispatcher, asked him if he knew anything about that overpass, whether there had been any accidents there or anything that might explain what I was seeing. Charlie had been routing drivers through that area for 15 years, and he told me the bridge was perfectly ordinary, built in the 70s when the interstate went through. Nothing special about it except that it carried old Highway 47 over the main road. No accidents that he knew of, no ghost stories or local legends, just another piece of concrete in the middle of nowhere. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was drawing me back to that bridge, Some invisible thread that pulled tighter every time I ran that route. I started timing my trips to pass by around the same time each night, and the voice was always there, waiting for me like an old friend. Sometimes I caught glimpses of the figure on the bridge, always just for a moment, always too brief to be certain of what I was seeing. She seemed to be wearing different clothes each time, sometimes a flowing dress, sometimes what looked like a nightgown, once what might have been a wedding gown that fluttered in the wind like trapped moonlight. Other drivers started to notice my behavior when we talked on the CB radio. Big rigs have a way of creating their own community on the long hauls, and word gets around when someone starts acting strange. A few of the old-timers mentioned they'd heard singing near that overpass too, usually late at night when they were running behind schedule and fighting sleep. Most dismissed it as road hypnosis or audio hallucinations, the kind of thing that happens when you've been staring at white lines for too many hours. But a couple of them seemed genuinely spooked when they talked about it. One driver, a woman named Susan who hauled livestock out of Texas, told me she'd seen children on the bridge, 3 or 4 small figures holding hands and swaying in time with the music. Another, an old-timer called Preacher Dan, swore he'd heard multiple voices singing in harmony, like a church choir practicing hymns in the middle of the night. The more stories I heard, the more convinced I became that something significant was happening at that overpass, something that went beyond simple acoustics or shared delusions. I started doing research at truck stop internet terminals, searching for information about old Highway 47 and the area around the bridge. What I found made my blood run cold. The overpass had been built over the site of an old homestead, a small farm that had been in the same family for 3 generations, until a house fire in 1967 killed everyone inside. A young mother named Maria Santos and her 3 children had perished in the blaze, which started in the middle of the night and spread too quickly for them to escape. The father had been away on business, and when he returned to find his family gone, he'd never recovered from the grief. Local newspaper accounts described Maria as a devoted mother who was known throughout the community for her beautiful singing voice. She had performed in the church choir and often sang lullabies to neighborhood children when their parents were working late. The children who survived her often talked about how safe they felt when she sang to them, how her voice could calm any fear or soothe any nightmare. After the fire, several people reported hearing singing near the ruins of the house, but these reports gradually faded as the area was cleared for highway construction. The next time I passed the overpass, I approached it with a mixture of anticipation and dread, knowing now what I was likely to encounter but unable to stay away. The singing began as usual as I drew near, but this time I could hear the distinct voices of children joining in, high and sweet and infinitely sad. As I passed beneath the bridge, I looked up and saw them clearly for the first time. A young woman in a singed nightgown standing with her arms around 3 small children, all of them translucent against the night sky, all of them singing the same heartbreaking lullaby. Their eyes met mine for just an instant, and I saw such profound love and loss in the woman's gaze that I had to pull over on the shoulder, my hands shaking too badly to maintain control of the truck. The singing continued even after I'd stopped, floating across the desert air like a benediction, and I understood with sudden clarity that Maria Santos was still trying to comfort travelers on this lonely stretch of road, the Mirror Mile, from Marcus. The highway stretched ahead of me like a black ribbon, slick with rain that had been falling steadily since I crossed the Missouri state line 3 hours ago. My Kenworth's headlights carved through the darkness, illuminating the endless white dashes that seemed to pulse with their own hypnotic rhythm. It was nearly 2 in the morning, and I should have stopped at the last truck stop, but the dispatcher's voice kept echoing in my head about the tight delivery schedule. 23 years I'd been hauling freight across these midnight highways, and I'd learned to push through when the miles demanded it. The rain drummed against the windshield with increasing intensity, forcing me to slow down as the wipers struggled to keep pace. Through the passenger window, I caught glimpses of farmland rolling away into the void, occasional barn lights twinkling like distant stars. The CB radio crackled with static, picking up fragments of conversations from truckers miles away, their voices fading in and out like lost souls calling across dimensions. That's when I first noticed the lake. It appeared suddenly on my right, a massive body of water that hadn't been marked on any of my maps. The surface was impossibly still despite the storm, creating a perfect mirror that reflected my truck's running lights as I passed. I'd driven this route dozens of times, hauling everything from electronics to furniture between Kansas City and Chicago, but I'd never seen this lake before. The sight of it made me ease off the accelerator slightly, my curiosity piqued by its sudden appearance in what should have been endless farmland. The reflection of my truck moved alongside me on the water's surface, a ghostly double of red and amber lights dancing across the dark mirror. There was something mesmerizing about watching that parallel version of myself, maintaining perfect synchronization as I navigated the gentle curves of the highway. The reflection seemed clearer than it should have been, given the distance from the road to the water's edge, and I found myself glancing at it more frequently than I should have while driving. As I continued along the lake's perimeter, I began to notice other details that didn't quite add up. The shoreline was too perfectly straight, running parallel to the highway for what seemed like miles without the natural irregularities you'd expect from a natural body of water. The surface remained completely undisturbed by the rain, each droplet seeming to stop just short of touching the water. Most unsettling of all, the reflection of my headlights extended further into the depths than physics should have allowed, creating twin tunnels of light that seemed to burrow endlessly downward. The CB radio suddenly burst to life with crystal clarity, startling me from my contemplation of the strange lake. "Eastbound Kenworth approaching mile marker 172, came a voice that sounded oddly familiar. "You seeing what I'm seeing out there?" I glanced at my odometer and felt a chill run down my spine. I was indeed approaching mile marker 172, but there were no other trucks visible in either direction. The highway stretched empty in both my mirrors and through the windshield ahead. I reached for the CB handset, thumb hovering over the talk button, when the voice continued. "That lake came out of nowhere, didn't it? Been driving this route for over 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it." The voice was definitely familiar now, carrying the same slight rasp from years of cigarettes that I'd quit 5 years ago. The same Midwest accent I heard every time I left a voicemail. It was my voice, transmitted from somewhere in the darkness. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I tried to process what was happening. The reflection of my truck continued to keep perfect pace on the lake's surface, but now I could swear I saw movement in the cab of that mirrored Kenworth. The silhouette of a driver leaning forward, reaching for something, just as I was reaching for my CB handset. The synchronization was perfect and terrifying. "If you can hear this," my own voice continued over the radio, "whatever you do, don't look directly at the lake. There's something wrong with the reflection. It's showing things that haven't happened yet." The transmission cut to static, leaving me alone with the sound of rain and my truck's diesel engine humming through the night. But it was too late for the warning. I was already looking, already transfixed by the impossible clarity of that reflection. In the mirrored surface, I could see my truck beginning to veer slightly toward the right, toward the lake itself. The reflected Marcus was turning the steering wheel, and I felt my own hands beginning to move in response, as if drawn by some invisible force. The boundary between the real truck and its reflection was blurring, and I couldn't tell which version was leading and which was following. The highway began to curve gently to the right, following the lake's shoreline. But something was wrong with the geometry. The curve was too sharp, bending far more than the gentle arc I'd been following. I pressed the brake pedal, but my speed remained constant, as if the truck had developed a will of its own. In the side mirror, I could see the highway behind me stretching straight back into the darkness, showing no sign of the curve I was navigating. That's when I realized the truth that made my blood freeze in my veins. I was no longer on the highway. Somehow, impossibly, my truck was driving on the surface of the lake itself, following the reflection of the road that lay beneath the water. The white dashes beneath my wheels glowed with an ethereal light, and I could see the real highway running parallel above me or perhaps below me, the distinction having lost all meaning. The reflected world around me was identical to the one I'd left, but subtly wrong in ways that made my mind struggle to process the differences. The rain fell upward here, droplets rising from the lake's surface toward a sky that might have been the bottom of the real world. The radio crackled with transmissions from truckers driving routes that didn't exist, their voices echoing across dimensions as they navigated highways that were mirror images of the roads they thought they knew. In the distance, I could see the lights of other vehicles all driving on this phantom road beneath the lake's surface. But as they passed, I realized they were all reflections too, ghostly doubles of trucks and cars that were traveling the real highway somewhere above. Each driver sat behind their wheel staring straight ahead, unaware that they had crossed over into this aquatic mirror world where the rules of physics bent and twisted like the light refracting through water. I grabbed the CB handset and tried to call out, hoping to make contact with the real world, but my voice only joined the chorus of confused and frightened drivers who had found themselves trapped in this reflected reality. "This is eastbound Kenworth," I called, hearing my own words echo strangely in the cab. "I'm driving under the lake, following a road that shouldn't exist. Can anyone copy?" "We copy," came a response almost immediately. But the voice was my own again, transmitted from somewhere else in this underwater highway system. Been trying to find the way back to the surface for what feels like hours. The exit ramps all lead deeper into the lake, and the mile markers are counting backward. As if summoned by my radio call, I began to see the exit ramps he mentioned. They spiraled downward into the depths like concrete helixes, their green signs advertising destinations that existed only in this submerged reflection of the world. Little Egypt, 2 miles. Nowhere Junction, next 3 exits. Surface road, road closed. Each sign glowed with the same ethereal phosphorescence as the lane markers, casting an eerie green light that penetrated far deeper into the water than it should have been able to. My fuel gauge, which had been showing a comfortable half tank when I first noticed the lake, now hovered near empty. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. As I watched, the needle began to move backward, refilling as if time itself was running in reverse. The clock on my dashboard showed digits that shifted and changed randomly, sometimes displaying times that hadn't occurred yet, sometimes showing dates from years past. The CB radio burst to life again with a cacophony of voices, all variations of my own, all describing the same impossible journey. Some claimed to have been driving these underwater highways for days, others for years. One voice, distorted and fading, spoke of reaching the deepest levels of the lake where the road surface was made of something that wasn't quite asphalt, something organic that pulsed with its own rhythm. Another described finding truck stops staffed by attendants who moved with fluid, swimming motions, their eyes reflecting light like those of deep-sea creatures. I realized that I had to make a choice, and I had to make it soon. Ahead of me, the underwater highway split into 2 directions. The left fork curved upward, marked with a sign that read, "Surface Conditions Unknown." The right fork descended even deeper, its sign simply reading, "Continue, all services available." The town that keeps forgetting its name, from Marcus Wheeler. The GPS died somewhere between Millfield and nowhere, its screen flickering once before going black as the dashboard clock struck 11:47. I'd been driving this same route for 8 years, hauling machinery parts from Detroit to Nashville, and I thought I knew every truck stop, every exit, every small town that barely registered as a dot on the highway map. The rain had been steady for the past hour, drumming against the windshield of my Peterbilt in a rhythm that matched the steady thrum of the diesel engine beneath me. The wipers swept back and forth with hypnotic precision, clearing away sheets of water only to have them replaced seconds later. That's when I saw the green highway sign emerging from the darkness ahead, illuminated by my headlights like a beacon in the storm. The white letters seemed to shimmer in the rain, and I squinted through the windshield to read them. "Welcome to Millbrook," it said. "Population 847. I frowned, adjusting my grip on the steering wheel. I'd never heard of Millbrook before, and I was certain this stretch of highway had never had any towns this close to the main route. The fuel gauge was hovering near empty, though, and the next truck stop I knew about was still 50 miles down the road. The off-ramp curved gently to the right, leading down into a valley where warm yellow lights twinkled like fallen stars against the darkness. As I downshifted and felt the engine brake engage, I noticed how quiet everything seemed despite the rain. No other vehicles on the ramp, no sounds except for the steady patter of water on metal and the soft hiss of my air brakes. The town spread out below me looked peaceful enough, with tree-lined streets and modest houses whose windows glowed with the soft light of evening lamps. Main Street was wider than I expected, easily accommodating my 18-wheeler as I rumbled slowly through the business district. Most of the shops were closed for the night, their darkened windows reflecting my headlights back at me like sleepy eyes. A small diner sat on the corner, its neon sign buzzing and flickering intermittently, casting pink and blue shadows across the wet pavement. "Rosie's All-Night Cafe," the sign read, though the letters seemed to waver slightly, as if the rain was distorting my vision. I pulled into the parking lot of a modest-looking gas station, the kind of family-owned operation that used to be common before the big chains moved in. The pumps were older models, but they looked well-maintained, and the price displayed seemed reasonable enough. As I climbed down from the cab, stretching muscles that had been cramped from hours of driving, I noticed how the rain seemed to muffle all sound. Even my boots on the wet asphalt made only the faintest splashing noise. The attendant who came out to help was a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes. He moved with the unhurried pace of someone who'd lived in a small town his entire life, and his smile seemed genuine as he approached. "Evening," he said, his voice carrying that particular warmth that small-town people often had with strangers. "Diesel, I'm guessing." "That's right," I replied, pulling my jacket tighter against the rain. "Fill her up, if you would. Been driving for hours and my GPS gave up the ghost a ways back." "I don't think I've ever noticed Millbrook before. Is it new?" The man paused in his work, the fuel nozzle halfway to my tank. For just a moment, his expression seemed confused, almost puzzled, as if he were trying to remember something important. "Millbrook," he repeated slowly, then shook his head and smiled again. "Of course, it's been here forever. My family's run this station for 3 generations. Sometimes feels like we're invisible, though, tucked away down here in the valley." While he filled the tank, I walked around to stretch my legs, breathing in air that smelled of rain and wet earth and something else I couldn't quite identify, something faintly sweet, like flowers that only bloomed at night. The town was remarkably quiet for a place that supposedly had nearly 900 residents. No cars moved on the streets, no lights flickered on or off in the houses, no dogs barked in the distance. It was as if the entire population had simply gone to sleep at exactly the same time. "You folks always this quiet at night?" I asked when I returned to pay for the fuel. The attendant counted out my change slowly, his movements deliberate and careful. "We're peaceful people," he said after a moment. "Early to bed, early to rise, as they say. Though I suppose we do things a little differently here than in most places." There was something in his tone that made me look at him more closely. His eyes seemed distant, unfocused, as if he were listening to something I couldn't hear. The rain continued to fall steadily, creating small rivers that ran down the gutters and pooled in the low spots of the parking lot. I thanked him and climbed back into my truck. eager to get back on the highway and continue toward Nashville. But as I drove back through the residential streets toward the on-ramp, something made me glance in my side mirror. The gas station sign was still visible in the distance, glowing softly through the rain, but the letters seemed different somehow, rearranged in a way that didn't quite match what I remembered. I slowed down and adjusted the mirror, trying to get a better look, but the angle wasn't right and the rain made everything blur together. The on-ramp back to the highway was exactly where it should have been, and within minutes I was back up to cruising speed, the steady rhythm of the road beneath my wheels. I tried to tune in a radio station to keep myself alert, but all I could find was static interrupted occasionally by fragments of music or conversation that faded in and out like distant memories. The fuel gauge showed full, the engine was running smoothly, and I had clear sailing ahead of me. 20 minutes later, I saw another green highway sign emerging from the darkness ahead. My headlights illuminated the white letters, and I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Welcome to Milldale, it read. Population 847. The same number of residents, but a different name. I checked my mirrors to make sure I hadn't somehow turned around, but the highway stretched straight behind me exactly as it should. This time I didn't take the exit. I kept my speed steady and my eyes fixed on the road ahead, telling myself that I'd simply misread the first sign, that the rain and the late hour were playing tricks with my vision. But as I passed the off-ramp, I couldn't help but notice that the lights in the valley below looked identical to those I'd seen before. The same pattern of streets, the same arrangement of houses, the same pink and blue neon flickering from what appeared to be the same corner diner. The radio crackled suddenly, and through the static I heard a voice, distant and distorted, but unmistakably human. "Welcome to Milford," it said, then faded back into white noise. I jabbed at the tuning buttons, trying to find the station again, but there was nothing but the endless hiss of empty frequencies. My hands were sweating now, despite the cool air in the cab. The windshield wipers continued their hypnotic sweep, back and forth, clearing away water that seemed heavier now, more persistent. I focused on the yellow lines in the road, using them to anchor myself to something real and solid and rational. This was just a night on the highway like thousands of others. I was tired, the weather was bad, and my mind was filling in details that weren't really there. But then I saw the third sign. "Welcome to Millmont," it announced. Population 847. The same exit, the same curve leading down into the valley, the same constellation of lights twinkling in the darkness below. This time I pulled over onto the shoulder, hazard lights flashing, and sat in the idling truck trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The rain drummed against the roof of the cab like impatient fingers, and the engine's steady rumble seemed almost comforting compared to the confusion swirling in my mind. I pulled out my cell phone, hoping to check my location, but there was no signal. The screen showed nothing but empty bars and a message that said no service available. I tried the CB radio, scanning through the channels for any other drivers who might be on this stretch of highway, but all I heard was static punctuated by occasional bursts of what sounded like old radio shows, fragments of music from decades past, and voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I took the third exit. The town looked exactly the same as before, down to the last detail. The same wide main street, the same darkened shop windows, the same family-owned gas station with the same middle-aged attendant coming out to greet me. The signal between stations tottered from Marcus. The first thing you learn driving long haul is that your truck becomes more than a vehicle after enough miles. It becomes home companion, and sometimes confessor to thoughts you'd never share with another living soul. My Peterbilt 379 and I had covered more than 800,000 miles together over 7 years, and I thought I knew every sound she made, every vibration that traveled through her frame, every quirk of her aging electrical system. But somewhere between Flagstaff and Albuquerque on that moonless October night, I discovered there was still something she'd been keeping from me. The interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon, my headlights carving a narrow tunnel through the darkness. Rain had been threatening all evening, and now it finally began, starting as scattered drops on the windshield before settling into a steady rhythm that mixed with the deep rumble of the diesel engine. The CB radio crackled occasionally with distant voices, truckers calling out speed traps and weather conditions, but mostly the cab was filled with the familiar symphony of the road, tires on wet asphalt, the gentle wheeze of air brakes from vehicles passing in the opposite direction, and the steady hum of the engine that had lulled me through countless nights like this one. I'd been fighting fatigue for the last hour, that dangerous drowsiness that creeps up on drivers despite all our training and experience. The digital clock on the dashboard glowed 2:17 a.m. in pale green numbers, and I knew I should be looking for a place to pull over for my mandatory rest break. But the next truck stop was still 30 miles ahead, and I wanted to push through rather than sleep on the shoulder. Coffee would help, I thought, reaching over toward the glove compartment where I kept a small thermos filled with the bitter brew from my last stop. That's when I first heard it. As my hand moved toward the glove compartment handle, a sound rose from somewhere near the dashboard, distinct from the engine noise and the rain. It was a low, almost musical humming, like the sound of electrical current flowing through copper wire, but with an organic quality that made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. I paused, my hand hovering over the black plastic handle, and listened. The sound continued, neither growing louder nor fading, maintaining a constant pitch that seemed to vibrate in harmony with something deep in my chest. I pulled the handle and the glove compartment dropped open with its usual sticky resistance. The overhead cab light was dim, but I could see well enough to notice that something was wrong. The compartment was empty, not just lacking the thermos I'd been reaching for, but completely, impossibly empty. Gone were my registration papers, the small flashlight, the emergency road flares, the packet of antacid tablets, even the collection of gas station receipts I'd been meaning to organize for weeks. The rectangular space looked larger than it should have, its black plastic interior seeming to extend further back than the dashboard's dimensions would allow, and the humming was definitely coming from inside. I reached in tentatively, my fingertips exploring the smooth plastic walls of the empty compartment. The humming grew slightly louder at my touch, and I could feel a faint vibration traveling up through my arm. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it carried with it a sense of wrongness that made my stomach tighten. I pulled my hand back and closed the compartment with a sharp snap, but the humming continued, now muffled but still clearly audible. The next few miles passed in a haze of confusion and growing unease. I tried to focus on driving, on the hypnotic sweep of the windshield wipers and the occasional flash of reflective road markers, but my attention kept drifting to that persistent sound. It seemed to be calling to something inside me, creating a resonance that made my thoughts feel loose and unfocused. I found myself reaching for the glove compartment handle again and again, then catching myself and forcing my hand back to the steering wheel. When I finally gave in to the compulsion and opened it again, the compartment looked different. The black plastic interior had taken on a subtle luminescence, as if lit from within by some source I couldn't identify. The humming was louder now, and I could distinguish different tones within it, like a chord being played on an instrument I'd never heard before. As I stared into that impossible space, I began to see movement in the depths, shadows shifting and flowing like smoke in a gentle breeze. I should have pulled over then. Every instinct screamed at me to get off the highway, to stop the truck and call for help. But the humming had worked its way into my nervous system, and each time I considered stopping, the sound would shift to a lower, more soothing frequency that made the idea seem unnecessary, even foolish. The miles continued to roll by, marked by the steady clicking of the odometer and the increasingly complex harmonies emerging from the glove compartment. The rain had stopped. I realized suddenly, though I couldn't remember when, The windshield wipers continued their rhythmic sweep across dry glass, and the sound they made seemed to blend with the humming in a way that created new patterns of noise, new frequencies that burrowed deeper into my consciousness. I reached out to turn off the wipers, but my hand moved instead to the glove compartment, drawn by a compulsion that felt stronger than my own will. This time, when it opened, I could see further into the space than should have been possible. The compartment extended back into the dashboard through the firewall, beyond the boundaries of the truck itself. In that impossible distance, shapes moved with purpose and intelligence, dark forms that might have been mechanical or organic or something altogether different. The humming had become a song now, wordless but full of meaning I couldn't quite grasp, and I found myself leaning closer to hear better. That's when I saw my registration papers floating in the darkness. They drifted slowly through the space like leaves in still water, along with my flashlight, the road flares, everything that had been in the glove compartment, but they looked different now, altered somehow. The papers seemed to be covered with text I didn't remember, symbols and diagrams that hurt to look at directly. The flashlight had extra switches and components that definitely hadn't been there before. Even the antacid tablets floated in their bottle, but the pills inside glowed with the same soft luminescence as the compartment walls. I tried to grab the registration papers, thinking that if I could just retrieve my normal, familiar belongings, everything would return to normal. But as my hand reached into that space, the humming suddenly spiked in volume and intensity, and pain shot through my arm like I'd grabbed a live electrical wire. I jerked back, but not before I felt something brush against my fingertips. Something that definitely wasn't plastic or paper or any material I could identify. The shapes in the distance were moving closer now, drawn by my intrusion into their space. As they approached, I began to make out details that made my vision blur and my head pound. They had the geometric precision of machines but moved with organic fluidity, and there were too many angles to them. Surfaces that folded in on themselves in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The humming had become almost deafening, though I realized that other drivers on the highway showed no signs of hearing it. A car passed me in the left lane, its occupants visible in the glow of their phone screens, completely unaware of the symphony of wrongness pouring from my dashboard. I tried to close the glove compartment, but the handle wouldn't respond. The door hung open like a mouth, and the luminescent interior pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. One of the shapes had nearly reached the opening now, and I could see that it was reaching toward me with appendages that might have been arms or tentacles or something else entirely. The air in the cab had grown thick and seemed to taste of copper and ozone. That's when my survival instincts finally overpowered whatever influence the humming had gained over me. I yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, sending the truck careening toward the shoulder of the highway. The sudden movement threw me against the door, and apparently broke whatever connection had been holding the glove compartment open. It slammed shut with a sound like a thunderclap, cutting off the humming so abruptly that the silence seemed louder than the noise had been. I wrestled the truck back under control and pulled onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires as I came to a shaking stop. For several minutes I just sat there, engine idling, trying to process what had happened. The glove compartment looked perfectly normal now, just a standard black plastic rectangle built into the dashboard. When I finally worked up the courage to open it again, I found all my belongings exactly where they should be, apparently unchanged, but the humming hadn't completely stopped. If I listened carefully, especially in the quiet moments between the rumble of passing traffic, I could still hear it. Fainter now, but definitely present. The backward rest. From Marcus Chen. The headlights of my Kenworth cut through the October darkness as I navigated the winding mountain highway, 43 tons of freight rolling steady behind me. I'd been driving this route between Salt Lake and Denver for 8 years. Knew every curve and grade by heart, but something felt different tonight. The familiar rhythm of diesel engine and road noise couldn't shake the unease that had settled in my chest since crossing the Colorado border 3 hours earlier. Rain began to spatter my windshield around midnight, fat drops that caught the amber glow of my running lights before the wipers swept them away. The weather report had called for clear skies, but mountain weather has its own rules. I'd learned that lesson plenty of times before. What bothered me wasn't the rain itself, but the fact that it seemed to be falling upward past my side windows, droplets climbing toward the dark sky instead of racing down toward the earth where they belonged. I told myself it was an optical illusion, maybe the way my cab lights hit the water, but the sight made my skin crawl anyway. 22 years behind the wheel teaches you to trust your instincts, and right now they were screaming that something wasn't right with this stretch of highway. The GPS showed another 40 miles to the next truck stop, but my fuel gauge was dancing near the quarter mark and my logbook demanded a mandatory rest break. That's when I saw the blue sign emerging from the darkness ahead, reflective letters spelling out rest area 1 mile. I couldn't remember a rest stop along this section of road, but the mountains played tricks with memory sometimes. New facilities went up, old ones got forgotten. The important thing was getting some fuel and a few hours of sleep before pushing on to Denver. The exit ramp curved sharply to the right, so tight I had to gear down and take it slow to keep my trailer tracking properly. As I rounded the bend, the rest stop spread out before me under harsh fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered like dying insects. The place looked wrong from the moment I saw it, though I couldn't immediately put my finger on why. The building sat at the far end of the parking area, a low concrete structure with darkened windows and a flat roof that seemed to absorb the pool of light around it. 3 other trucks occupied the lot, their running lights dark, cabs silent. I pulled into an empty space near the fuel pumps, set the air brakes with a satisfying hiss and shut down the engine. The sudden quiet felt oppressive after hours of road noise, broken only by the steady patter of rain on my roof and the electrical hum of those sickly fluorescent lights overhead. I climbed down from the cab, stretched muscles stiff from hours in the driver's seat, and walked toward the fuel island. That's when I noticed the first really wrong thing about this place. The pumps faced the wrong direction. Every truck stop in America has the same basic layout. Diesel islands positioned so trucks can pull through nose first and exit easily. But these pumps were turned around backward, designed so you'd have to back in from the highway and pull out in reverse. It made no sense from a traffic flow perspective, and it certainly wasn't safe. The fuel hose reached my tank easily enough, but I had to stretch it across the front of my cab instead of along the side like normal. The pump screen flickered through its startup sequence, green text scrolling past too fast to read properly. When it finally settled on the fuel selection menu, I noticed all the prices were listed in reverse. Highest octane at the bottom, diesel at the top. Even the company logo on the pump housing was upside down. While the tank filled, I walked over to check on the other drivers. Professional courtesy and genuine concern both demanded it. We look out for each other on the road, especially on nights when the world feels tilted wrong. But as I approached the first truck, a red Peterbilt with Illinois plates, I realized no one was in the cab. Same with the second rig and the third, all empty, keys still in the ignitions. Logbooks open on the dashboard showing dates from last week, last month, some going back over a year. The main building squatted ahead of me like a concrete toad, its windows black despite the lights I could see flickering behind them. The entrance doors were glass, but they'd been installed upside down, so the push bars were at the bottom and the hinges at the top. I had to crouch and push upward to get them open, and they swung up toward the ceiling instead of out toward the parking lot. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed with that same sick insect buzz, casting everything in a greenish pallor that made my skin look diseased. The convenience store shelves ran perpendicular to where they should be, creating narrow aisles that felt more like a maze than a shopping area. Products sat upside down or backward on the shelves. labels facing inward so you couldn't read them without pulling each item out to examine it. The coffee station occupied the far corner, but the pots sat upside down on their warmers, steam somehow rising downward from the inverted spouts into puddles of brown liquid on the floor. The smell was coffee, but wrong, like someone had mixed the grounds with something metallic and bitter. Road maps hung on a rotating display rack, but when I spun it to find Colorado, every single map showed the same section of highway I'd been driving, marked with a red X at this exact location. Behind the counter, a clerk sat reading a newspaper. At least I assumed it was a newspaper, though he held it upside down and turned the pages from back to front. He was middle-aged, wearing a standard convenience store uniform shirt, but everything about him seemed slightly off-kilter. When I approached the register, he looked up and smiled, and I saw that his eyes were two different colors, one brown and one pale blue, and they didn't quite track together when he moved his head. "Fill up on pump 3?" he asked, his voice perfectly normal except for a slight echo, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. His name tag read Jim, but the letters were backward, mirror images of themselves. "Yeah, but I'm having trouble with the card reader," I lied, wanting an excuse to stay in the light a little longer before going back outside. Something about the darkness beyond those windows made my skin crawl. "System's been acting up all night," Jim said, still smiling that not-quite-right smile. "Been getting drivers through here since around 10, but none of them seem to be heading out again. Funny thing about mountain roads, isn't it? Sometimes you take an exit and find yourself somewhere you've never been before, even though you've driven the same route 100 times. I felt ice water run down my spine at his words. "What do you mean, not heading out again?" The smile widened, showing teeth that were perfectly normal, except they seemed to reflect the fluorescent lights like metal. "Oh, they head out all right. Just not the direction they came from. See, this rest stop faces the wrong way. Built backward by mistake, they say, but I think it was on purpose. Everything here runs in reverse. Time, direction, even the way people leave." Outside, I heard a truck engine turning over, the familiar rumble of a big diesel starting up. Through the windows, I could see headlights moving across the parking lot, but they were moving backward, away from the highway exit toward the dark woods at the rear of the property. As I watched, the lights disappeared between the trees, engine noise fading until only the rain and the buzz of fluorescent lights remained. "That was Danny Morrison," Jim said conversationally, consulting a clipboard that appeared in his hands from nowhere. "Been coming through here every Tuesday night for 3 months now. Always heads out the back way, always comes around again next week. Funny how some people get stuck in patterns." My mouth had gone dry as desert sand. "I need to get back to my truck." "Sure thing," Jim said, and his backward name tag caught the light as he leaned forward. "Just remember, when you leave here, you'll be going the direction this place wants you to go. Not necessarily the direction you think you're heading. The highway exit's right there, plain as day. But sometimes the road has its own ideas about where it leads." I backed away from the counter, those mismatched eyes following my movement with predatory interest. The upside-down doors fought me as I tried to leave, swinging upward when I expected them to push out. And for a terrifying moment, I thought I was trapped inside with the backward clerk and his metal smile. Then I was through, running across the rain-slick pavement toward my truck. The Kenworth's engine turned over immediately. Thank God. And I had the transmission in gear before the air pressure even built completely. I didn't bother unhooking the fuel hose, just gunned it toward what I hoped was the exit. Behind me, I could hear Jim laughing through the rain, a sound like water running uphill. The exit ramp stretched ahead, but as I took the curve, I realized the road signs were facing the wrong direction. The architecture of absence from Marcus Wheeler. The fog rolled in like a living thing that October night, thick and deliberate, swallowing Interstate 84 between Portland and the Dalles with an almost purposeful hunger. I'd been driving the same route for 15 years, hauling lumber and paper products through the Columbia River Gorge, and I knew these mountains like the lines on my weathered hands. But that night, as my 18-wheeler's diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby, and the headlights carved weak tunnels through the gray blanket ahead, I began to understand that knowing a place and truly seeing it are two entirely different things. The fog had started as wisps near Hood River, innocent tendrils that danced across my windshield like ghostly fingers. ICB radio crackled with the usual chatter from other drivers. Warnings about visibility and reduced speeds. Nothing unusual for this time of year when the warm river air meets the cooling mountain slopes. I adjusted my mirrors, flicked on my hazards, and settled into the careful rhythm that fog driving demands. The yellow lines became my lifeline. The rumble strips my guide as civilization disappeared behind walls of gray. What struck me first wasn't what I couldn't see, but what I could. My route normally took me past the familiar landmarks that mark a trucker's progress like mileposts of memory. The truck stop near Cascade Locks with its always flickering neon sign advertising coffee and diesel. The lumber mill outside Stevenson, its smokestacks reaching toward the sky like concrete prayers. The scattered farmhouses and gas stations that dot the highway like beacons of human presence in the wilderness. But as the fog thickened, these waypoints began to vanish, not gradually fading as visibility decreased, but disappearing completely, as if they had never existed at all. I first noticed it at the Chevron station where I usually grabbed coffee during my late runs. I knew the location by heart, could navigate to it in my sleep, and my internal clock told me I should be approaching the familiar glow of its overhead canopy. I slowed my rig, expecting to see the hazy outline of gas pumps materializing through the fog, but the roadside remained empty. Not obscured, not hidden, but genuinely empty, as if the station had been carefully erased from existence. The asphalt where it should have stood stretched smooth and unmarked, weeds growing where concrete islands should have anchored the fuel dispensers. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Perhaps I'd miscalculated the distance. Maybe the fog was playing tricks with my depth perception. Truckers develop an almost supernatural sense of place on familiar routes, but even the best of us can be thrown off by unusual conditions. I checked my GPS, but the screen showed only a blank gray area where my location should have been displayed, as if the satellites themselves couldn't penetrate the fog's embrace. The CB radio had gone silent, the usual chatter replaced by a soft static that sounded almost like breathing. The next missing landmark was the lumber mill, a massive complex that normally announced itself long before it came into view, with the sweet scent of sawdust and the distant whine of industrial saws. I knew its location precisely, could time my approach by the mile markers and the gentle curve of the highway that brought it into view. But as I rounded the familiar bend, my headlights illuminated nothing but empty fields where the sprawling facility should have stood. No buildings, no smokestacks, no security lights cutting through the fog. The land lay bare and wild, covered in tall grass that swayed in the gentle breeze as if it had grown undisturbed for decades. A cold certainty began to settle in my chest as I realized that the fog wasn't simply hiding these places. It was somehow replacing them with versions of the world where they had never been built. Each missing structure left behind a landscape that looked completely natural, untouched by human hands, as if the earth itself was showing me what it had looked like before we came along and decided to change it. The phenomenon defied every rational explanation I could conjure, yet the evidence rolled past my windows with each revolution of my tires. The most unsettling part wasn't the absence of buildings, but how perfect these empty spaces appeared, where the truck stop should have stood. The natural contours of the land flowed seamlessly, native grasses and wildflowers carpeting the earth, where the lumber mill should have sprawled. Old-growth forests stretched their ancient arms toward the hidden sky, trees too massive and mature to have grown in the decades since the mill's construction. It was as if I was glimpsing glimpses of the original world, the one that existed before highways and development carved up the wilderness into manageable pieces. My diesel engine continued its steady rumble, but even that familiar sound began to take on an otherworldly quality in the thick silence that surrounded me. The fog seemed to muffle not just vision but sound itself, creating a cocoon of isolation that pressed against my truck from all sides. I tried the radio again, scanning through channels that should have carried distant stations, but found only that same soft static that might have been wind through trees or the whisper of something watching from the gray void beyond my headlights. As the miles accumulated on my odometer, more structures failed to appear where my experience insisted they should be. A roadside diner known for its 24-hour coffee became a meadow where deer stood motionless at the forest's edge, their eyes reflecting my headlights like points of amber flame before they melted back into the darkness. A gas station with a distinctive red roof transformed into a crystal-clear stream that babbled over smooth stones, following a course that seemed to flow directly through where the building's foundation should have been anchored. The highway itself remained perfectly intact, its asphalt surface solid beneath my wheels, the yellow lines freshly painted and clearly visible in my headlight beams. Whatever force was at work seemed to have no interest in erasing infrastructure entirely, only in selectively removing certain human intrusions while leaving others untouched. It was as if the fog carried within it some ancient memory of the land, and was choosing to share that memory with anyone brave or foolish enough to travel through its domain. I began to notice that the absences weren't random. Every missing building had been modern, constructed within the last 50 years as development spread along the highway corridor. But older structures, barns and farmhouses that had stood since the early days of settlement, remained visible through the fog like islands of historical permanence. A weathered barn from the 1920s materialized beside the road, its unpainted wood silvered with age, while the modern house that should have stood beside it was nowhere to be found. The message seemed clear. Only the newest scars on the landscape were being healed by this strange phenomenon. The fog began to thin as I climbed toward higher elevation, and with its retreat came the gradual return of familiar landmarks. The first structure to reappear was an old stone bridge built during the Depression, its sturdy arches unchanged by the passage of time. Then came a historic Grange Hall, its windows dark but its solid frame reassuringly present. Modern civilization returned in reverse chronological order, newer buildings flickering back into existence as if someone was slowly turning up the dial on a radio that had been tuned to the wrong frequency. By the time I reached the Dalles, the fog had retreated to wispy tendrils that clung to the river valley, like reluctant spirits returning to their rest. The truck stop there blazed with familiar neon, its parking lot full of rigs whose drivers probably had no idea what had transpired in the fog-shrouded miles behind me. I pulled into a space and sat for a long moment, engine idling, trying to process what I had experienced in that gray limbo between the present and some version of the past that had never quite accepted its displacement. I've made that run dozens of times since, always watching for fog, always wondering if the phenomenon would repeat itself. Sometimes, on particularly thick nights, I catch glimpses of things that shouldn't be there, or notice the absence of things that should. A forest where a strip mall belongs, a meadow where a factory should stand, as if the fog carries with it the power to show us the world as it was, and perhaps as it yearns to be again. The land remembers everything we've forgotten, and sometimes in the gray hours before dawn it finds ways to share those memories with those of us who spend our nights traveling its forgotten paths. When light dies from Marcus, the thing about driving 18-wheelers cross-country for 23 years is that you learn to trust your equipment above all else. Your air brakes, your transmission, your sleeper cab that becomes home for weeks at a time, and most importantly, your headlights. Those twin beams cutting through the darkness ahead become your lifeline, your window into the world that rushes toward you at 70 miles per hour. So when they started failing me on that October night outside Bakersfield, I should have pulled over immediately, should have called dispatch, found the nearest truck stop. done anything except what I actually did, which was keep driving deeper into that suffocating California darkness. The trouble began subtly, the way most disasters do. I was hauling a load of electronics from Los Angeles to Seattle, a routine run I'd made dozens of times before. My Peterbilt 379, a beauty I'd nicknamed Silver Lady for her chrome finish that caught moonlight like water, had been running smooth as silk for the past 400 miles. The engine hummed with that deep, reassuring rumble that tells a driver everything's functioning exactly as it should. The cab was warm against the desert chill seeping through the windows, and my CB radio crackled occasionally with the distant chatter of other drivers somewhere out there in the vast emptiness of Interstate 5. It was just past midnight when I first noticed something wasn't quite right with my headlights. At first I thought it might be my eyes playing tricks on me after hours of staring at the road. The high beams seemed dimmer somehow, as though the bulbs were slowly dying. But when I checked my electrical systems, everything showed normal. Voltage was steady, alternator charging properly, no warning lights on the dashboard. Yet the illumination cast by my headlights appeared to be shrinking, pulling back toward the truck like a tide retreating from shore. I flicked the lights off and on again, toggled between high and low beams, even pulled over briefly to check if something was blocking the lenses. Nothing. The headlight housings were clean. The bulbs appeared bright when I looked directly at them, but somehow the light they produced barely reached 50 feet ahead of my bumper. It was as though the darkness itself had grown thicker, more resistant to penetration, swallowing the photons before they could travel their normal distance. Any sensible driver would have found a place to stop right then, but I was already running behind schedule due to a delayed loading dock in Long Beach, and my delivery window in Seattle was tight. The road ahead appeared empty of other traffic, and I reasoned that even diminished headlights were better than no headlights at all. I dropped my speed to 45 miles per hour and continued north, telling myself I'd stop at the next truck stop to have a mechanic take a look. The next hour passed in growing unease as my lights continued their mysterious retreat. What had started as merely dim illumination was becoming something far more troubling. The circle of visible road ahead of me kept contracting, pulling inward like a closing aperture, until I could barely see 30 feet beyond my front bumper. The sensation was deeply unsettling, like driving through an endless tunnel with walls of absolute black pressing in from all sides. I tried adjusting my mirrors to catch any light from behind, but even my taillights seemed affected by whatever phenomenon was consuming my visibility. The red glow that should have painted the road behind me in crimson waves appeared muted, distant as though filtered through layers of thick gauze. The darkness wasn't simply an absence of light anymore. It had become something active, hungry, feeding on every photon my truck produced. The CB radio had gone silent sometime earlier, though I hadn't noticed exactly when. Static filled the channels where voices should have been, a soft hissing that reminded me uncomfortably of whispers just below the threshold of understanding. I adjusted the squelch, changed channels, even switched to the emergency frequency, but found only that same empty static. It was as though every other driver on the road had simply vanished, leaving me alone in this shrinking bubble of dying light. That's when I began to notice the shapes moving beyond the reach of my headlights. At first, I dismissed them as tricks of tired vision, the kind of phantom movements that plague long-haul drivers during endless night runs. But as my illumination continued to fail, those shapes became more distinct, more purposeful in their motion. They seemed to pace my truck, staying just outside the furthest edge of my light's reach. Dark forms that suggested size and intelligence without revealing any concrete details. I pressed harder on the accelerator, but the shapes matched my increased speed effortlessly. They weren't running alongside the road like animals might. They were gliding, flowing through the darkness with a fluid grace that made my skin crawl. When I slowed down, they slowed with me. When I swerved slightly to test my suspicions, they adjusted their positions accordingly, maintaining that precise distance just beyond my failing vision. The worst part was their apparent interest in my truck. I could feel attention focused on me from multiple directions, as though invisible eyes were studying my every movement, analyzing my reactions, waiting for something. The darkness had become populated with watchers, and I was their sole focus, trapped in a cocoon of dying light while unknown things circled just outside my perception. My headlights were now providing maybe 15 feet of forward visibility, barely enough to see the white lane markers beneath my wheels. The highway still felt solid under my tires. The yellow center line still occasionally flickered past, but everything beyond that narrow strip of illuminated asphalt had become an abyss filled with patient, moving shadows. I fumbled for my cell phone, hoping to call dispatch, but the screen showed no signal bars. Not unusual in this remote stretch of California, but combined with the radio silence and failing lights, it added another layer to my growing isolation. The GPS display flickered intermittently, sometimes showing my location on Interstate 5, other times displaying nothing but blank space, as though I'd driven off the edge of any mapped world. The engine temperature remained normal, fuel levels adequate, all mechanical systems functioning properly, yet I felt certain that something fundamental was wrong with reality itself around my truck. The darkness wasn't just dark anymore. It was consciously suppressing light, actively working to blind me, to trap me in an ever-shrinking prison of visibility. Then my headlights began to flicker. Not the steady fade they'd been undergoing, but sudden rhythmic pulses like a heartbeat made of photons. During the brief moments when they flared to something approaching normal brightness, I caught glimpses of the shapes that had been stalking me. They were enormous, easily the size of buildings, moving with impossible silence across the landscape. In those split-second illuminations, I saw surfaces that might have been skin, or might have been something else entirely. Textures that seemed to shift and flow like living liquid. The flickering intensified, creating a strobe effect that made driving nearly impossible. During the flashes of light, more details emerged from the darkness. Too many legs or arms or appendages, eyes that reflected like mirrors, geometries that hurt to perceive directly. Between the flashes, the darkness felt heavier than before, pressing against my windows like something physical trying to force its way inside the cab. I could hear them now, or thought I could. Sounds that came from everywhere at once. Low-frequency vibrations that resonated through the truck's frame and into my bones. Not quite voices, not quite music, but something that suggested both while being neither. The CB static had synchronized with these sounds, creating harmonies that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. My speedometer showed I was still moving at 40 miles per hour, but the sensation of forward motion was becoming disconnected from any sense of actual travel. The mile markers had stopped appearing in my flickering headlight beams, and the road surface itself looked different somehow, darker than asphalt should be, with a texture that seemed organic rather than manufactured. That's when I realized the shapes weren't just following me anymore. They were herding me, guiding my path through subtle adjustments to their positions, encouraging me to take certain curves, discouraging turns in other directions. Despite my hands on the steering wheel, despite my foot on the accelerator, I was no longer truly driving. I was being driven, conducted through the darkness toward some destination I couldn't see or imagine. The headlights gave one final, brilliant flash that revealed far too much of what surrounded me, then died completely. But instead of the absolute darkness I expected, a different kind of illumination began to seep into my vision. The shapes that had been stalking me were glowing with their own internal light, a phosphorescence that outlined their impossible anatomies in shades of blue and green, and colors for which I had no names. Their attention was no longer focused on my truck, but on something ahead, something that drew their interest like moths to flame. I followed their gaze and saw lights in the distance, not the harsh yellow of sodium highway lamps, but something softer, more welcoming. A truck stop, perhaps, or a rest area where I could finally escape this nightmare of failing illumination and patient stalkers. The ramp that runs like honey, from Marcus. The CB radio had been crackling with strange reports all night, voices drifting through the static like whispers from another world. Truckers talking about a stretch of highway somewhere near the Nevada-California border, where things weren't quite right, where the asphalt seemed to move in ways that defied explanation. I'd been hauling freight across these western routes for 15 years, and I'd heard plenty of tall tales born from too much coffee and too little sleep. But something in their voices made me listen closer as I guided my Peterbilt through the desert darkness. The luminous green numbers on my dashboard clock read 2:47 a.m. when I first caught sight of the interchange ahead, its concrete curves rising from the desert floor like the fossilized skeleton of some enormous serpent. Highway 127 stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of worn asphalt that seemed to absorb the light from my headlights rather than reflect it back. The usual desert wind had died to an unnatural stillness, leaving only the steady rumble of my diesel engine and the soft hiss of air brakes from the truck ahead of me in the distance. I'd planned to take the next off-ramp to grab some coffee and check my logbook, maybe catch a few hours of rest at the truck stop that should have been just beyond the overpass. The GPS on my dashboard showed the exit clearly enough, a simple loop that would carry me down to the service road and back to civilization. But as I approached the off-ramp, something in the quality of light seemed different, as if the sodium vapor lamps that lined the interchange were glowing through water instead of clear desert air. The first sign that something was wrong came when I downshifted to take the ramp and felt my truck begin to climb what should have been a gentle descent toward the truck stop below. My engine whined in protest as if I were hauling a double load up a mountain grade instead of coasting down a standard highway exit. The concrete barriers on either side of the ramp seemed to waver in my peripheral vision, their straight edges blurring like heat mirages even though the desert night was cool enough that I could see my breath fogging the windshield. I eased off the accelerator and felt the strangest sensation, as if my truck were moving through something thicker than air but not quite solid, like driving through invisible honey that clung to my wheels and axles. The speedometer showed 25 miles per hour, but the sensation of forward movement felt slower, dreamlike, as if time itself had become viscous around this particular stretch of roadway. The concrete beneath my tires made a different sound too, not the familiar rumble of rubber on pavement, but something softer, almost organic, like the whisper of wind through tall grass. As I rounded the curve of the off-ramp, I noticed that the painted yellow lines marking the edge of the road seemed to pulse with their own faint luminescence, creating patterns that shifted and flowed like living things. The lines weren't straight anymore either, but curved and twisted in ways that hurt to look at directly, as if someone had tried to paint normal road markings on a surface that refused to stay still long enough for the paint to dry properly. The truck stop that should have been visible below me was nowhere to be seen, replaced by a vast expanse of desert that stretched beyond the reach of my headlights. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part was that the off-ramp itself seemed to be stretching, extending far longer than any normal highway exit, curving around and around in a spiral that defied the simple loop shown on my GPS. I'd been driving for what felt like 10 minutes on what should have been a 30-second descent, and still the ramp continued, carrying me deeper into the desert darkness. I tried to radio for help, but the CB produced only a strange humming sound, like the drone of insects on a summer evening. My cell phone showed no signal. Not unusual in this part of the desert, but the screen itself seemed to flicker and distort, as if the device were slowly melting from the inside out. The plastic housing felt warm to the touch, warmer than it should have been even after hours of charging from the truck's power supply. The concrete barriers on either side of the ramp had begun to sag, their tops drooping like softened candle wax, and I realized with growing horror that the road surface itself was starting to behave the same way. The asphalt beneath my tires felt increasingly soft, not enough to trap my truck, but enough to create the unsettling sensation that I was driving across the surface of something alive, something that was slowly digesting the very infrastructure it was supposed to support. I pressed the accelerator harder, hoping to power through whatever strange atmospheric phenomenon was affecting this section of highway. But my truck continued to move at that same dreamlike pace despite the protest of my engine. The temperature gauge began to climb, not from engine strain, but because the air itself seemed to be getting warmer, thick and humid like the atmosphere inside a greenhouse. My window started to fog despite the dry desert climate I'd been driving through all night. That's when I saw the other trucks. They appeared gradually in my headlights, scattered across what should have been empty desert on either side of the impossible ramp, sitting at odd angles as if they'd simply slid off the road and come to rest in the sand. But as I drew closer, I could see that they weren't resting on the ground at all. They were sinking very slowly into what looked like solid earth, but moved with the consistency of quicksand. Some were nearly buried with only their cab roofs and smokestacks visible above the surface. Others had sunk only to their axles, their chrome bumpers and headlight housings gradually disappearing beneath the desert floor. The drivers were still behind their wheels, sitting perfectly upright as if patiently waiting for the road conditions to improve. Their hands rested calmly on their steering wheels, their faces turned straight ahead toward windshields that reflected my headlights like mirrors. They didn't wave for help or show any sign of distress. They simply sat there motionless as their vehicle slowly melted into the landscape around them. I tried to honk my horn to get their attention, but the sound that emerged was muffled and distorted, like someone shouting underwater. The noise seemed to hang in the thick air for far longer than it should have, echoing back from distances that shouldn't have existed in the flat desert terrain. One of the drivers turned his head toward me as the sound reached him, and I caught a glimpse of his face in my headlights. His features were blurred and indistinct, as if I were looking at him through frosted glass, but his eyes were clearly visible, wide and aware and completely, utterly calm. The road beneath my own truck was becoming increasingly unstable, the solid asphalt taking on the texture of cooling tar. My steering wheel required more and more effort to turn, as if the front wheels were moving through increasingly thick liquid. The painted lines had begun to run together, creating abstract patterns that seemed to move independently of any breeze or vibration from passing traffic. The guardrails stretched and sagged like taffy left too long in the sun. I realized that I had become part of the same phenomenon that had claimed the other truckers scattered around me in the desert. The off-ramp was melting, taking everything on it down into some kind of geological anomaly that existed just beneath the surface of normal reality. The pavement, the concrete, the metal barriers, even the very air itself, were all slowly liquefying around me, creating a pocket of space where the usual rules of physics had been suspended. My truck began to tilt slightly to the left as the road surface beneath my driver's side wheels became too soft to support the weight. I could feel the whole massive vehicle starting to sink, just a fraction of an inch at first, but with the inexorable persistence of something caught in genuine quicksand. The diesel engine continued to run perfectly. All my gauges showed normal readings, but nothing I could do with the controls seemed to affect my slow descent toward whatever waited below the melting highway. The other truckers were watching me now, dozens of them visible in the sweep of my headlights, their faces turned toward my truck with expressions of patient understanding. They knew exactly what was happening to me because it had already happened to them, and their calm acceptance was somehow more terrifying than any amount of panic or struggle would have been. They had simply given up fighting the inevitable and allowed themselves to become part of the landscape. I tried everything I could think of, shifting into reverse, engaging the differential lock, even attempting to radio a mayday call on the emergency frequency. But the melting effect seemed to extend beyond the physical realm into the electromagnetic spectrum itself. Radio waves moved sluggishly through the thick air. My electrical systems operated at half their normal efficiency, and even the light from my headlamps seemed to bend and curve in impossible ways as it traveled through the viscous atmosphere that surrounded the dissolving, Interchange just when I thought I would have to accept the same fate as the other drivers. When my truck had sunk far enough that the desert sand was beginning to lap at my door handles like liquid against the hull of a sinking ship. The static that follows. From Jake Morrison. The thing about being a long-haul trucker is that after 23 years on the road, you think you've heard every possible variation of CB chatter that exists. Lot lizards looking for business, DOT warnings about inspection stations, and lonely drivers just wanting someone to talk to through the endless miles of American asphalt. But what I picked up on Interstate 80, somewhere between Nebraska and Wyoming, changed everything. I thought I knew about the voices that travel our airwaves. It started on a Tuesday night in late October when the first real cold snap of the season was settling over the plains. I was hauling a load of auto parts from Detroit to Sacramento, running behind schedule because of construction delays outside Chicago. My Peterbilt 379 was humming along at a steady 70, the Jake brake occasionally growling as I navigated the gentle rolling hills that stretched endlessly into the darkness ahead. The radio had been quiet for the better part of an hour, which wasn't unusual for this stretch of nowhere. Just the occasional trucker checking in with his dispatcher or someone asking about road conditions up ahead. The heater was working overtime against the October chill, and I had the windows cracked just slightly to keep the cab from getting too stuffy. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying with it the promise of an early winter that would make the next few months of driving more challenging than usual. The dashboard lights cast their familiar green glow across my weathered hands as they gripped the steering wheel, and the steady rhythm of the road beneath my 18 wheels created that hypnotic drone that every driver knows can either keep you alert or lull you into dangerous complacency. That's when I first heard it, cutting through the static around Channel 19 like a knife through butter. The voice was clear as crystal, clearer than any CB transmission I'd ever received, with no hint of the usual crackling or interference that comes with long-distance broadcasts. It was a woman's voice, young-sounding, maybe in her 20s, and there was something in her tone that made me reach for the volume knob without even thinking about it. Breaker 19. "This is Nightingale looking for my daddy," she said, her words carrying a strange echo that seemed to bounce around inside my cab long after she'd finished speaking. "He's driving a blue Kenworth, should be somewhere between the Big Muddy and the Rocky Mountains. Daddy, if you can hear this, please come back. I've been waiting so long." I glanced at my watch and saw it was just past midnight, which meant I'd been driving for nearly 14 hours straight. Road fatigue could play tricks on a driver's mind, make you hear things that weren't there or see movement in your peripheral vision that turned out to be nothing more than shadows cast by your own headlights. But this voice was too clear, too present to be a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and too much coffee. The transmission ended, and Channel 19 returned to its usual quiet static. I waited a few minutes, expecting someone to respond. Maybe another driver who'd heard the call and wanted to help, or perhaps the father she was looking for. But the airwaves remained silent except for the gentle white noise that filled the spaces between voices. I considered keying up my mic to ask if anyone else had heard the broadcast, but something held me back. A feeling I couldn't quite name that suggested it might be better to leave well enough alone. 20 minutes later, just as I was starting to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, her voice came through again, identical in every way to the first transmission. Same words, same tone, same strange echo that seemed to linger in the air after she'd finished speaking. "Breaker 19, this is Nightingale looking for my daddy. He's driving a blue Kenworth, should be somewhere between the Big Muddy and the Rocky Mountains. Daddy, if you can hear this, please come back. I've been waiting so long." The repetition sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the October wind seeping through my cracked windows. In all my years of listening to CB chatter, I'd never heard anyone repeat a transmission word for word with such mechanical precision. Even the most desperate or disturbed drivers would vary their language slightly, add new details, or change their inflection as they repeated their calls. But Nightingale's second transmission was a perfect duplicate of the first, down to the last syllable. I reached for my CB handset, my thumb hovering over the talk button as I tried to decide whether to respond. The fatherly instinct in me wanted to help, to offer whatever assistance I could to a young woman who sounded lost and alone in the endless night. But there was something else, a growing sense of unease that made my skin crawl and my hands tremble slightly as they held the microphone. The voice was too perfect, too clear, too consistent to be entirely human. Before I could make up my mind, another voice crackled through the speaker, this one belonging to an older man with the gravelly tone that comes from years of cigarettes and diesel fumes. "Nightingale, this is Smoke Ring in a westbound 18-wheeler. I ain't seen no blue Kenworth tonight, but I'll keep my eyes peeled. You got a 20 on your daddy's last known location?" The silence that followed stretched on for several long minutes, punctuated only by the steady rumble of my engine and the whisper of wind against the cab. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for Nightingale to respond to Smoke Ring's offer of help. But when her voice finally returned to Channel 19, it was exactly the same message she'd broadcast twice before, delivered with the same inflection and the same haunting echo. "Breaker 19, this is Nightingale looking for my daddy. He's driving a blue Kenworth, should be somewhere between the Big Muddy and the Rocky Mountains. Daddy, if you can hear this, please come back. I've been waiting so long." Smoke Ring tried again, his voice taking on a note of concern. "Nightingale, you copy? This is Smoke Ring coming back. Are you receiving, little lady?" But again there was no direct response, just another repetition of her original message 20 minutes later, as regular as clockwork. By the time I reached the truck stop in Sterling, Colorado, I'd heard Nightingale's transmission 6 more times, always identical, always precisely 20 minutes apart. The consistency was becoming deeply disturbing, like listening to a recording that someone was playing over and over again on the CB frequencies. But who would do such a thing, and why? The airwaves were supposed to be for communication between drivers, not for whatever psychological game this was turning into. I pulled into the truck stop planning to grab a few hours of sleep before continuing west. But the idea of lying in my sleeper berth while that voice continued its mechanical repetition every 20 minutes made my stomach turn. Instead, I parked near the fuel island and walked into the diner, hoping to find other drivers who might have heard the broadcast and could help me make sense of what was happening. The diner was typical of its kind, all worn vinyl booths and fluorescent lighting that buzzed like angry insects overhead. A handful of drivers sat scattered around the room, nursing coffee and picking at plates of food that had been sitting under heat lamps too long. I approached a table where 2 older drivers were talking in low voices, their CB radios crackling quietly beside their coffee cups. "Either of you been monitoring Channel 19 tonight?" I asked, sliding into the booth across from them. "There's been some strange chatter coming through." The driver on the left, a heavy-set man with gray stubble and tired eyes, nodded slowly. "You mean that gal looking for her daddy? Been listening to her for the past hour or so. Creepy as hell, the way she says the exact same thing every time." His companion, a thin man wearing a baseball cap advertising a trucking company I didn't recognize, leaned forward conspiratorially. "I've been driving this route for 15 years, and I heard that same transmission about 3 years ago. Same voice, same words, same everything. Thought it was just some kids playing pranks on the CB, but hearing it again..." He shook his head and took a sip of his coffee. The gray stubble driver's eyes widened. 3 years ago? You sure about that?" "Dead sure. It was right around this time of year. Late October, cold snap coming through. Scared the hell out of me then, and it's doing the same thing now. Makes you wonder who's really out there broadcasting, and why they're doing it." We sat in uncomfortable silence for a few moments, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what we were hearing on the airwaves. The diner's fluorescent lights continued their incessant buzzing, and somewhere in the kitchen, a radio was playing country music at low volume. providing a mundane counterpoint to our increasingly surreal conversation. That's when all three of our CB radios crackled to life simultaneously, Nightingale's voice filling the diner with crystal clear precision. The exit that remembers. From Marcus. The thing about driving long haul is that you develop a relationship with the road, and sometimes the road develops one right back with you. Interstate 81 through Virginia had always been good to me in my 15 years behind the wheel of this Kenworth. The curves felt familiar beneath my tires, the grade changes predictable as breathing, and every exit ramp a reliable friend offering fuel, food, or rest when I needed it most. That was before exit 247 started taking things personally. The first time I missed it was 3 months ago on a foggy October night. I'd been hauling auto parts from Detroit to Charlotte, making good time despite the weather that had rolled in somewhere around Harrisonburg. The fog wasn't unusual for that stretch of highway, the way it settled thick and gray between the Blue Ridge foothills like cigarette smoke in a closed diner. I knew exit 247 was coming up, the one with the decent truck stop where they served coffee that didn't taste like burnt motor, oil, and had showers clean enough that you didn't feel dirtier walking out than going in. I'd taken that exit maybe 100 times over the years, always at mile marker 246.8, right after the overpass where the highway curved slightly left around the base of a wooded hill. My GPS showed it clear as day, that familiar blue arrow pointing toward the off-ramp, and I had my turn signal clicking away like a mechanical heartbeat. But when I reached the spot where the exit should have been, there was nothing but guardrail and darkness stretching into the fog-swallowed tree line. At first, I figured I'd miscounted the mile markers in the poor visibility. Fog plays tricks on your eyes, makes distances compress and expand like you're looking through a funhouse mirror. I took the next exit instead, a smaller one that led to a lonely Exxon station with fluorescent lights that buzzed like trapped insects, and a clerk who looked at me like I'd crawled out of the fog myself. When I asked about the truck stop at exit 247, he gave me directions that led right back to where I'd been looking, said it had been there for 20 years, never moved, never closed. The second time it happened was in November, on a clear night with stars sharp enough to cut glass. I was running ahead of schedule on a furniture haul to Richmond, the kind of night where you can see your headlights stretching out for miles, and every mile marker stands out crisp and white against the darkness. I'd been thinking about that missed exit for weeks, wondering if maybe I was getting too old for this work, if my eyes were starting to go or my mind was playing tricks after too many years of watching endless yellow lines disappear under my bumper. But I knew exactly where I was when I approached exit 247 that November night. I could see the overpass ahead, the familiar curve in the highway, even the outline of the truck stop sign glowing beyond the tree line. My CB radio was picking up chatter from other drivers, and I heard Jake Morrison in his red Peterbilt mention that he was fueling up at the very exit I was approaching. The GPS showed it plain as day, that blue line arcing off to the right where it had always been. Yet when I reached the spot, when I came around that curve at exactly the right mile marker, there was nothing but solid guardrail and a wall of pine trees pressed so close to the highway, I could have reached out and touched their branches. No exit ramp, no truck stop, no sign of Jake Morrison or anyone else. It was as if the exit had never existed, as if the forest had swallowed it whole and sealed itself back up without leaving so much as a scar. I pulled over at the next rest area and called Jake on the radio. He answered immediately, told me he was just finishing up his fuel and grabbing a sandwich at the truck stop. When I asked for directions, he described the exact location where I'd been looking. The same overpass, the same curve around the wooded hill. He even offered to wait for me. Said he'd flash his headlights when he saw my Kenworth approaching. I drove back following his directions to the letter and found nothing but empty highway and darkness. That's when I started to understand that something was wrong. Not with my eyes or my mind, but with the exit itself. It wasn't that I was missing exit 247. It was that exit 247 was missing me, deliberately hiding itself every time I approached, like a building that only exists when certain people aren't looking at it. The realization should have been more disturbing than it was, but after 15 years of long-haul driving, you learn to accept that the road has its own mysteries. You see things in your headlights that aren't quite right, catch glimpses of movement in your peripheral vision that vanish when you turn your head, hear voices on the CB from drivers who don't show up on GPS. The highway between midnight and dawn is a different place than it is during daylight hours, governed by different rules, host to different kinds of reality. So I started testing it, approaching exit 247 with the methodical patience of a scientist conducting an experiment. December brought ice storms that turned the highway into a skating rink, but the exit remained hidden. January brought snow that piled up in dirty gray mountains along the shoulders, and still the exit refused to appear for me. February brought fog again, thick as cotton batting, and I drove through the spot where exit 247 should have been like it was nothing but empty air. Other drivers continued to report using the exit, continued to describe the truck stop in perfect detail. They talked about Martha, the night shift waitress who remembered everyone's coffee preferences and never wrote down an order, but never got one wrong either. They mentioned the mechanic named Carlos, who could diagnose engine trouble just by listening to your idle, and the shower stalls that always had hot water no matter how busy the place got. These weren't generic truck stop descriptions, they were specific, personal, consistent between different drivers who had never met each other. But for me, exit 247 had become invisible, unreachable, as purposefully hidden as a secret door that only opens for the right password. I began to wonder what I had done to offend it, what sin I might have committed against the unspoken etiquette of the road. Had I been rude to another driver? Had I failed to help someone who needed assistance? Had I somehow broken faith with the mysterious contract that exists between a trucker and the highway? The answer came to me on a rainy March night when the memory surfaced unbidden, triggered by the sound of my windshield wipers beating their steady rhythm against a spring downpour. It had been 5 years ago, maybe 6, another rainy night much like this one. I'd been approaching exit 247 in heavy traffic, a long line of trucks and cars creeping through construction zones and lane closures, everyone tired and irritable and eager to reach their destinations. A car had been trying to merge from the on-ramp, a small sedan with out-of-state plates and a nervous driver who couldn't find a gap in the steady stream of vehicles. I'd seen them signaling, seen them pacing along beside the traffic looking for someone to slow down and let them in. I could have eased off the accelerator, could have given them the space they needed to merge safely. It would have cost me nothing but a few seconds. Instead, I'd maintained my speed and position, boxed them out along with the driver behind me, forced them to slow down and try again further back in the line. It wasn't malicious, just indifferent. The kind of small selfishness that highway driving can breed when you're focused on schedules and delivery deadlines, rather than common courtesy. I had forgotten about it almost immediately, filed it away as just another minor interaction in the endless stream of highway encounters. But the exit remembered. Exit 247 had been watching, had taken note of my failure of kindness, and had decided that I was no longer welcome to use its services. The more I thought about it, the more sense it made in the strange logic of highway mysteries. Roads are built on countless small interactions between strangers, tiny moments of cooperation and consideration that keep traffic flowing and prevent chaos. When you violate that trust, when you choose selfish convenience over community courtesy, perhaps some exits remember and hold grudges. The rain was coming down harder now, turning my windshield into a streaming sheet of water despite the wiper's best efforts. I could see the familiar mile markers approaching, could feel that subtle change in the highway's rhythm that meant exit 247 was coming up. This time, though, I had a plan. This time I was going to make amends. I slowed down well before the exit, activated my four-way flashers, and pulled into the right lane. As I approached the curve around the wooded hill, I saw them, a small sedan with out-of-state plates, trying to merge from what looked like an on-ramp, but which should have been impossible since there was no exit for them to have used. The car was exactly like the one I'd boxed out years ago, maybe the same make and model, maybe even the same nervous driver behind the wheel. The passenger who saw tomorrow, from Marcus. The interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon through the Nevada desert, and my Peterbilt's headlights carved twin tunnels through the darkness. I'd been driving for Consolidated Freight for 12 years, hauling everything from auto parts to electronics across the southwestern routes, but I'd never picked up a hitchhiker until that September night, when the air conditioning failed somewhere outside of Barstow. The heat was unbearable even with the windows down, and the radio crackled with static between distant stations playing songs from decades past. That's when I saw her standing beneath the flickering neon of a long-abandoned truck stop. Thumb extended toward the highway. She appeared to be in her 30s, wearing a simple blue dress that seemed untouched by the desert dust swirling around her feet. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, and she stood with perfect posture despite the late hour. I rarely stopped for strangers, but something about her stillness in that desolate place made me ease the big rig to a gradual halt on the shoulder. The engine's idle rumbled through the cab as I rolled down the passenger window and called out to ask where she was headed. She approached the truck with measured steps, her face partially shadowed by the dim glow of my running lights. Las Vegas would be perfect, she said, her voice carrying a soft accent I couldn't quite place. I have family there waiting for me. There was something oddly formal about the way she spoke, as if English weren't her first language, though she pronounced each word with careful precision. I told her to climb up, and she moved with surprising grace for someone boarding an 18-wheeler. As she settled into the passenger seat and I pulled back onto the highway, I noticed she kept her head turned slightly away from me, facing the passenger window as if fascinated by the passing landscape of scrub brush and distant mountains. The desert at night has a stark beauty that many people find mesmerizing, so I thought nothing of it initially. We drove in comfortable silence for the first 20 miles, the engine's steady hum mixing with the rush of wind through the open windows. "You drive this route often?" she asked eventually, still gazing out at the darkness. I explained that I made the run between Phoenix and Vegas twice a week, usually hauling consumer goods to the big box stores and casinos. The familiar rhythm of small talk helped pass the miles, though I found myself doing most of the talking, while she listened with what seemed like genuine interest. When I glanced over during our conversation, I noticed something odd about the way she sat. Her head remained turned toward the window, but her body was angled slightly in my direction, as if she were listening intently while watching something specific outside. The position struck me as uncomfortable, almost unnatural, but I attributed it to politeness or perhaps shyness around strangers. The miles rolled beneath us as we crossed into Nevada, and I found myself growing drowsy despite the company. The monotonous hum of tires on asphalt and the steady vibration of the diesel engine created a hypnotic rhythm that always threatened to lull me to sleep on these late-night runs. That's when she began to speak in a way that made my drowsiness vanish completely. "The truck stop ahead has good coffee," she said casually, still facing the window. "The old man behind the counter makes it strong the way drivers like it." I looked ahead into the darkness and saw nothing but empty highway stretching toward the horizon. The GPS on my dashboard showed the next services were still 40 miles away, at a place I'd never heard of called Desert Springs. "Which truck stop?" I asked, but she continued as if she hadn't heard my question. "You'll see the sign in about 3 minutes. The S in Springs flickers sometimes because of a loose connection." Her tone remained conversational, as if she were describing something, clearly visible rather than making predictions about places that might not even exist. I felt the first real chill of unease. creep up my spine despite the warm night air flowing through the cab. The desert highway ahead remained empty, lit only by my headlights and the distant stars scattered across the Nevada sky. Yet she spoke with such specific certainty that I found myself unconsciously checking the odometer and watching for signs. 3 minutes later, exactly as she had said, a weathered sign appeared in my headlights advertising Desert Springs Truck Stop. Next exit. The S in Springs flickered erratically, casting intermittent shadows across the faded letters. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as a cold sensation spread through my chest despite the warm night air. "How did you know about that sign?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She finally turned slightly in my direction, though her face remained mostly in shadow. "I've traveled this road before," she said simply, but something in her tone suggested a meaning deeper than the words themselves. As we approached the exit, I could see the truck stop's lights casting a pale glow across the desert floor. It looked exactly as she had described, a small weathered building with a few gas pumps and a parking area sized for big rigs. An elderly man was indeed visible through the windows, standing behind a counter inside the brightly lit convenience store. I decided to stop, partly for coffee but mostly because I needed a moment to process what was happening. As I downshifted and guided the truck toward the exit ramp, she spoke again with that same casual certainty. "The restroom key is attached to a large plastic cactus. The coffee cost $2.50, but he'll only have change for a $5 if you pay with exact bills." The truck stop was deserted except for the attendant, just as she had predicted. I parked near the building and shut down the engine, and the sudden silence felt almost oppressive after hours of road noise. She remained seated, still facing partially away from me, and said she would wait in the truck while I went inside. The elderly attendant greeted me with a nod and gestured toward the coffee station without being asked. The restroom key hung on a hook behind the counter, attached to exactly the type of plastic cactus she had described. The coffee cost $2.50, and when I handed him a $10 bill, he apologized and said he could only make change if I had a $5 instead. I walked back to the truck in a daze, my mind struggling to process the impossibility of what was happening. She sat exactly as I had left her, gazing out the passenger window at the desert landscape. When I climbed back into the cab and started the engine, she began speaking again about things that hadn't happened yet. "The highway patrol officer ahead is running radar," she said as we merged back onto the interstate. "He's parked behind the overpass at mile marker 127 using a laser unit. You're going 2 miles over the speed limit." I immediately checked my speedometer and saw she was correct about my speed. Mile marker 127 was still 15 miles ahead according to my GPS. When we reached the overpass, a Nevada highway patrol car was indeed positioned exactly where she had said, and I caught the brief flash of a laser speed detector as we passed. The officer remained parked, apparently satisfied with my legal speed, but I felt my hands trembling slightly as I gripped the steering wheel. "How are you doing this?" I asked directly, no longer trying to hide my growing alarm. For the first time since she had entered the truck, she turned to face me completely, and what I saw made my blood freeze in my veins. Her eyes were wrong, terribly wrong, facing backward in their sockets as if someone had surgically rotated them 180 degrees. The irises and pupils pointed toward the back of her skull, leaving only the whites visible when she looked forward. "I see what's coming," she said simply, apparently unbothered by my horrified reaction. "It's always been this way for me. The accident that did this to my eyes, it changed how I experience time. I see the road ahead by looking behind me, and I see the past by looking forward. It's why I need rides from people like you, Marcus." The fact that she knew my name, which I had never mentioned, sent a new wave of terror through me. I realized she had been seeing the future throughout our entire conversation, describing things that would happen as if they were memories of the past. The truck stop, the police officer, every detail had been prediction rather than observation. "What else do you see?" I asked. though part of me dreaded the answer. She turned those backward eyes toward me again, and I forced myself not to look away despite the overwhelming wrongness of her appearance. "There's a choice coming," she said quietly. "In 18 miles, you'll see a woman standing beside a broken-down car. If you stop to help her, you'll arrive in Las Vegas safely and on schedule. If you don't stop, something else happens." "What kind of something else?" The question came out as barely a whisper, but she heard it over the engine noise and road sounds. Her backward gaze seemed to focus on something invisible behind my head, and her expression grew troubled.